Hey, sovereign wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to Iran War Week 6, the final acts, Lebanon, the deal, and the big print. We're going to be covering two parts in this week's episode. First, in part one, we're going to be going through Iran War Week 6, the final acts. Now, while many people think it's going to escalate, we covered everything step by step over the last 6 weeks and how it was leading to the deal rather than an actual World War III or nuclear war like everyone was predicting. So I'm going to be covering how I think, based upon the information that we have, how the Iran war ends, the role of Lebanon, the deals that are being negotiated, and what they actually mean, because this is one of the biggest changes we will ever experience in our lifetime. And that's not me being hyperbolic or exaggerating. This is literally the construct of the end of the post-World War II Bretton Woods system. And of course, you need to protect yourself and be sovereign, because in line with the crisis is a global reset that you need to navigate and get your way through. So with that in mind, in part two, I'm going to be discussing what the big print means and the big print, when it actually begins. To do that, I actually sat down on BTC sessions with the author of the big print, Lawrence Lepard, and we had a conversation on the war, markets, the reset, how it relates to the military-industrial complex, and everything in between. So we're going to be discussing exactly how you get to a $7 to $10 trillion big print and what the consequences are and how to protect yourself. So without further ado, let's jump right into part one, the final acts, how the Iran war ends, the Lebanon situation, the deals that are being negotiated, what they mean, and the global reset. So as a quick recap, I'll make sure that all of these week 1 to 6 updates and everything that comes next until we're done is on one blog for those that want to learn exactly how these things work with real-time analysis in real time, so you can see what I was able to predict, what I wasn't, and how you can actually use that analysis in order to make sure that you protect yourself as well. So during week 1, when it was live and happening, I talked about that this was the initial shock phase, the shock and awe campaign. In week 2, this led the framework for the global reset with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which led to the negotiation of approximately 50 different commodities and essential energy assets and resources, from food to fertilizer and everything in between, which had to be repriced around a framework and the price of oil, the yields on the bond of the US debt, and how that set the tone for everything that happened afterwards. Week 3, I predicted, when everyone was saying we're going to World War III, that we've now entered into the settlement phase. Everyone from both sides was telling me there's no settlement. This is a long war that's going to go on forever. And I was saying, here's how I think the settlement framework works, from way before the war as well. And this war, in my framework, was in fact negotiated, and there was a strategy to purge the different factions of power rather than a country versus country, US, Iran versus America. There were factions of power affiliated with both the financial industrial complex and the military industrial complex, and a future vision for regional stability and to what you need to do to get rid of the different factions of power to usher in this new world order effectively. In week 4, I discussed the Build Back Better model and how the strategic targeting was about laying the framework for the different trade routes, the different rebuild, and how that works in terms of the companies that benefit from it, and how you're actually able to forward read these things by looking at what is being destroyed. I remember right at the beginning, I said the Middle East will not go into peace, like years ago, until you have normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which I believe we already had via China, and they will be best buddies again at the end of this when the GCC and Iran normalize towards the end. A solution for the Palestinian state. We talked about the border peace and how it's not justice. but it is the solution that's most likely to happen, and we'll continue to analyze as we get more information. I was also sharing how Palestine can build its more sovereign status as well, to learn from anybody that's been through this disgusting build back better phase. That's not my words. That's just the words that the World Economic Forum would use for such a thing. And obviously, the third thing is the exit of the US. And one way of exiting is to militarily destroy the US presence in the region and then replace it with new contracts that have both regional negotiations, like defense contracts between Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and then the other factions that were lining up, like UAE, India, and Ukraine, and various other things that happened throughout the deal. Plus, obviously, BRICS towards the east, and then genuine defense contracts with Western financial portfolio companies rather than the US as a nation state, which is more aligned with the military industrial complex. So anyway, we talked about the transition phase and how that it looks and that it had already begun. And then we got the confirmation in week 5. This is where the market confirmed what we were talking about. And we were looking at oil, bonds, and the supply chains that are breaking in order to find the companies that were benefiting, the nations that were benefiting, how to interpret that, and why every time oil hit $115, the yield on the 10-year bond, 4.5%, and the yield on the 30-year bond, approximately 5% on the 30-year yield and 4.5% on the 10-year yield, because that impacts mortgages. It impacts whether there's a recession or a depression. It impacts the price of these force majeure cancellation contracts, and everything in between. And then the countries that will be impacted, and therefore the vulture capitalists, the venture capitalists, and the different national interests like the Belt and Road Initiative, and who's likely to, what the world's likely to look after that as well. So we got the market confirmations that we're headed in this direction. And I talked about, gold prices, markets, and how they're reacting. And finally, what we're going to be covering today in week 6 is the final negotiation mechanics and basically the closing sequence that I'm expecting from here. So now that we've got an understanding of that, we're going to dive right in. One of the most interesting things, now remember, I always put on 2 hats. I speak very differently when I'm wearing my humanitarian hat. That's where I talk about the sheer disgusting ethnic cleansing, genocide, settler colonialism, crimes against humanity, pillaging, and everything that's happening, because the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex have zero consideration of human casualty and any type of humanity. They're analyzing spreadsheets, they distance themselves, and they're part of a leveraged Epstein class that just doesn't care and is in these compromised networks that I've always talked about within the proof of weapons network. Now, then we go to the analytical. This is where I take off my humanitarian hat and I be whatever I like it or not. I analyze what I think is happening and I try and take away any bias and any concept of humanity that makes us humans in order to analyze and think like the psychopaths that actually are in charge of where these things go next. And really, I've always said it is theatrical. Now, theatrical does not mean that the deaths are fake or anything like that. Everything is real. The tragedy is real, but they don't care. And so that's not factored into the equation in terms of how these things work. Theatrical means that there is factions of power that have negotiated a predetermined outcome and decided and continually adjust the set of sequences as we go through this managed transition where everybody has agreed on the outcome, but there are also factions of power that try to do false flags and take you off tilt from that plan, and therefore the plan needs to be adjusted. But the outcome has already been predetermined, And at some point, these can go off rail, because what the financial industrial complex does whenever they do their covert missions is they hedge both sides. So they have a plan for the optimum outcome, a plan for how they make money if it goes wrong, and also the hedges that they have in between, so that either way they're able to use the derivatives market in order to manipulate the outcome by controlling the markets as well. And so, with that in mind, what I'd like you to do in this theatrical theme, we have seen that effectively this war has played out on Trump's Truth Social. Calling it truth, I think, is very reflective of how America as an economy works. It's fake it till you make it, lie it into existence, and just PR it to reality rather than anything that is real. In Truth Social, across Twitter and social media. And we started to see these artificial intelligence movies from the Iran side that kind of balanced out the propaganda, because half of this has been an information war. So we've had this two-way propaganda throughout. But the artificial intelligence movie that were coming from the Iran side were really very reflective of a lot of my analysis in terms of the blackmail networks, the financial market manipulation, and the framework by which I use in order to analyze the outcome. And really, a lot of these videos and the AI Lego movies and various other things that have gone viral and become infamous have been telling the story. Of course, it's propaganda from the Iranian side, but it has been really telling the story. So throughout this analysis, as we cover week 6, before we go to the part 2 interview, I'm going to play a few of those videos just to catch you up and lighten the tone slightly as well, despite the humanitarian crisis and severity of the situation. So with that in mind, I'm going to play the first AI video on the Iranian propaganda side, which really goes through the story so far, and how we've had this different game of financial weapons of mass destruction as a result of the attack from America and Israel that have been doing decapitation campaigns. And we set up a game where effectively Iran is being used in order to destroy the US military bases from the Gulf countries and the region. Israel is being used as a decapitation campaign for hardliners. And Iran, in terms of the pragmatic side internally, I believe is doing internal regime change for regime survival. And I hate to use the word regime because that's propaganda in itself, but we do know that the IRGC is effectively an economy within a country. They control the banking, the port, the military side, and they have a structure where there is a supreme leader, a decentralized IRGC, and then a government underneath it. So the government reformist pragmatic side, I believe, is aligned with China, who fund the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, who's aligned with BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and the financial industrial complex, who can profit from both war and stability. But in the Middle East, they're pushing for a regional stability vision, which involves China's plan for normalization, the removal of the radical Zionist ideology from Israel, the defeat of the neocon radical evangelical Christian Zionists, Lindsey Graham, that type of stuff, narrative within the US, and also the hardliner IRGC, death to Israel, death to America narrative that created that strategic tension that allowed the forever war to exist by having 40 years of Israel saying they're trying to attack us, and Iran saying, we're being told that they're 2 weeks away from a nuke. And so $10 trillion of money printing destabilized the region and really was the backbone of the post-World War II Bretton Woods world order. And we're going to be discussing today exactly how these events end that, and then what you can do to prepare and what it looks like next. So with that in mind, let's play the first AI movie video that kind of recaps the story so far. Enjoy it, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so let's jump right into week 6. To me, week 6 really represents what I believe will be the final acts. Now, we may go on for several weeks and we'll keep going until this thing is over. But to me, this is the final acts of the Iran war. I said that we needed a Hollywood movie in order to end this. And we got the Hollywood movie, which was a failed ground invasion that was meant to go into Iran from most of the analysis and do a ground invasion to steal some highly enriched uranium and then have a Hollywood movie so that the US can exit and say, hey, we took down the enriched, we took down the nuclear program. Now, the problem is that failed because they fired down some of the fighter jets, and then there was a real freak out where we had this 48-hour deadline where it looked like Trump was threatening the religion of Islam, as well as saying that we're going to have mass civilian casualties, and it was wording around having basically dropping a nuke. And so that led to this 48-hour deadline where in the final hour, Trump capitulated and gave in to the 10-point plan. We'll go around that as well. So that was, I believe, a failed Hollywood movie that was intercepted by the factions of the IRGC that are aligned with the preservation of the forever war military industrial complex model. And so therefore, we ended up derailing the plan slightly, but nothing stops this train. And that was confirmed by the acceptance of the offer with strategic ambiguity so that it could enter into a negotiation phase and a really set up the final front, which I'm going to be covering today as well. And so you notice that Pete Hegseth and Trump and everyone talked about almost like a Venezuelan style mission where they came in and they protected the pilot, cared that they care about lives. And really that was a failed ground invasion mission, which we're going to find out more and more. Many people were analyzing it at the time. Either way, I believe that was meant to be the Hollywood movie that they didn't get. So they replaced it with a different Hollywood movie, which is a rescue mission, despite the fact that the fighter jets were taken down. So, but the most important thing here is I don't think the conflict is collapsing. It's entering into the closing stage of the negotiated end state. Which is obviously the opening up of the Strait of Hormuz, the removal of the post-World War II Bretton Woods New Order, the transfer of assets over to the financial industrial complex, the ending of the forever war model in the Middle East, and the setting up of the next wars so that the military can make up for lost profits as a result of this negotiated outcome. So what do we need in order to get to this next phase? Well, they needed to escalate and set up a new war front, which was Lebanon. And so Lebanon became the next escalation point. And it was also setting up really the final negotiating lever. Now, again, humanitarian hat, analytical hat. Everything I just said is analytical. Let's do humanitarian hat for a second. This is sheer crimes against humanity. I know people that have died as a result of this. I was in a restaurant recently speaking to some of my brothers from Lebanon. And they were telling me about how they've had to rebuild their house 6 times. They live in a civilian area. They pretend that it's Hezbollah under the building. And the amount of deaths and civilian targets that happened, it was pure terrorism of the highest level. Analytical hat. At the same time, they're able to take out some Hezbollah targets. Hezbollah is able to effectively engage in a campaign of strategically weakening Israel and strategically weakening Hezbollah, which is an army connected to funding and building by Iran within Lebanon that was created as a resistance in 1982 from an Israeli invasion after the CIA did multiple infiltration attempts within Lebanon. And obviously, they destroyed the financial system through the IMF, destroyed the currency, destroyed people's savings in the banking system. And it led to the setting up of an alternative financial system where the Lebanese could deposit their gold and jewelry and get an interest-free interest-free loan using their collateral, and the IDF started coming in and destroying the locations where that collateral is and effectively stealing the assets. But what happened here? Why did we get to this negotiation lever? Well, when we did the lead up to the Hollywood movie, the 48-hour deadline, the nuclear threat, and then in the final hour, the complete capitulation, is because the negotiating market levers that I've always been talking about triggered in. We had approximately $115 oil. What did I tell you? Every time you get $115 or above, and we started to get WTI, I covered this all last week in the market levers, you get a capitulation and Trump has to push a new rabbit out of the hat, because the financial industrial complex doesn't want the demand destruction, but it does want the higher prices while it force majeures and renegotiates all of its contracts into this global reset. But they don't want it to go too high because it shuts down economic activity and takes us on another escalation cycle that I believe they're managing the cap of the price. So as soon as oil hit $115 as a result of this, boom, capitulation. The 10-year yield hit approximately 4.5%. If it goes higher, that takes mortgages above 7%, breaks the financial banking infrastructure. If we get the 30-year going above 5%, it creates bondholders and a doom loop in the US debt spiral that means they can't do a managed transition because you enter into a crisis mode, which I don't believe the financial industrial complex wants, but they're prepared for anyway, which we'll be covering in part 2 on the big print as well. But the US original objectives, let's think back to it. What were the original objectives that we were told? Well, firstly, they did Operation Ajax 2.0 and pretended they were protecting the Iranian people, while Mossad was effectively creating an environment that would lead to an uprising after Scott Bessent destroyed the currency, destroyed the savings of the Iranian people. That led to an inflationary cycle. And because of all the previous sanctions, there's economic hardship. And so that led to a PR campaign to pretend that the CIA asset, the son of the Shah, was going to come along and save the Iranian people, even though he's just a paid asset that was never going to do that. And that incites people to uprise against their government when the IRGC, a militarized faction, the Guard, when people and Mossad agents combined with them start firing at people, they're going to fire back. Now, there was the propaganda of the 45,000 deaths. When it was confirmed on the Iran side, 3,000, whatever it is, we will never know the full truth. But as a result of that, we got some of the internal regime change, the justification for war, the decapitation campaigns, and then America did the invasion pretending they were saving the Iranian people. But what were the actual goals set when they started saying more of the truth? Well, they started saying that there were 5 strategic objectives. And then as a result of the Strait of Hormuz closure, they added a 6th strategic objective. What was strategic objective 1? Prevent Iran nuclear weapons. That has not been achieved. In the 12-day war, they created the theatrics. So nuclear weapons, not been, there will still be a nuclear program. The number 2, now obviously they've depleted infrastructure above ground, but most of the infrastructure is below ground, which they can't get. The second one is to destroy the missiles and their capacity to effectively, have the drones. Now, there's this asymmetric war where drones powered by artificial intelligence and Russian, Chinese technology, as well as Iranian technology and missiles, mean that you don't need to be, troops on the ground tanks, planes, various other things, because you can fire those planes with missiles, exactly as happened here as well. So the idea is to destroy that. Now, I think they've depleted a lot of the infrastructure, steel manufacturing, various other things, but obviously they still got imports and relationships with Iran and China. They still got their own capacity, and a lot of it happens underground as well. So that can never be achieved without a over 1 million person ground invasion and maybe 20 years, and still that's absolutely questionable. So we know that that's not possible. Number three was to neutralize any of the military forces. Well, we've been talked about there's maybe 10,000 troops on the Iranian side, plus the ability to call in the people that are now protecting their country. There's like 1 million. So you'd need like 4 million or something crazy in order to actually make that a viable strategy. So that's not there. The fourth is to reduce the proxy networks. To a certain degree, we have seen that containment. This contains, Yemen, who effectively the Biden administration tried to wipe out, failed. Trump administration tried to wipe out, failed. But it ended in a negotiated ceasefire in Gaza and also a deal between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia that right up until now has held. Now, they could close the Red Sea, which would create an economic tsunami after the Strait of Hormuz has been closed. And that would really take down markets and push oil almost up to $200 if that were to happen. But that hasn't happened so far. Then you've got the Iraq side. We've seen different missions there. Then you've got Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has been the final front. And then you've got Hamas within Gaza, which is held up by the border peace and ceasefire arrangement as a result of that. And we move back to that front. But obviously, Israel has continually violated the ceasefire in both Lebanon with Hezbollah and in Gaza with Hamas as well. And we had one little reaction from the Houthis, as a result of breaking the ceasefire with Lebanon as well. But so far, the Houthi side has been contained with a very credible threat. So that's not been achieved, but I think it will be achieved politically, while militarily we get this escalation. Eventually, I've always predicted that the proxies, the resistance, whichever side of the propaganda you want to sit, effectively will be normalized and integrated into the local state armies as part of the regional stability mission. There are some people that would not be on board with that. So they've had decapitation campaigns and things like the pager attack on Hezbollah, which was installed 10 years ago. I think it was allowed to happen from the pragmatic sides of the internal sides of Iran that are effectively managing this transition and agreeing to the optics that we're seeing that I've been covering throughout this whole thing. And then finally, 5 was regime change. Well, we replaced Khamenei with Khamenei, and my personal belief is that Khamenei was on this path. He was very elderly, this was pragmatic for the country and the people. And so therefore there was a transition. I couldn't prove any of that, and it doesn't matter anyway. But I think that the new Khamenei is continuing the work of managing the next phase of the transition. But we've had decapitation campaigns throughout this whole thing. And so I believe that those that are resisting against the plan are being taken out either internally in this very dangerous mission or outsourced to Israel and US as well, effectively. So Iran is destroying the US military bases. Israel is taking out some of the proxy infrastructure. US is taking out some of the economic impact of the bases, which will vassalize Europe more into China's front and BRICS. And then Iran is weakening, and the Hezbollah is weakening Israel, which vassalizes them into economic reconstruction contracts that will be done via the GCC and BRICS. And then you achieve the strategic goals. And the US is weaker, Israel is weaker, Iran is weaker, but there is an economic plan that the financial industrial complex will be funding alongside BRICS, the Gulf countries, and transnational capital. And then they added the sixth goal, which was open the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz has been debated. Now, this is really significant, and I'll be covering more about it in relation to the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. But this effectively gave the following results. You had the MIC pivot from the forever war, escalate to de-escalate, into the FIC negotiations, the financial industrial complex negotiations that we're seeing right now. And what is the negotiation framework? Well, we had the US 15-point plan that was countered with Iran's 10-point plan that didn't meet any of the 6 strategic goals unless the plan was implemented, and effectively was very Iran favored. And so a clause was taken out in order to reset the final negotiation levers that I'm going to be covering right now. So in its simplicity, what was the settlement framework? Well, the first one was the 15-point plan by the US, which include sanction removal, which the financial industrial complex would like, Iran would like, BRICS would like. Now you need to do it managed because the GCC has been strategically weakened economically. And there was also a civil nuclear program support, i.e. nuclear energy, that is needed to power. Iran is one of the largest sovereign Bitcoin miners in the world. I believe it's done with nuclear energy, as well as the different types of artificial intelligence and everything, and civilian nuclear programs. It consisted of a nuclear freeze in terms of a framework. So you get to enrich, but there's some kind of freeze framework that can be used and is agreed and inspected, like we saw during the previous agreement, JCPOA, that Trump tore up. Enrichment was allowed under basically a set under limits. So that was the same as before Trump tore up the deal. There was a missile program deployed, and basically restructured around certain a framework. So that doesn't achieve the strategic goal. No weapons grade material was part of the condition. The organization that inspects nuclear weapons, the IAEA, supervision as there was before, and some kind of enforcement framework with the IAEA. The gradual compliance based upon implementation of the plan. So just like when you do an M&A deal, you have like payout clauses based upon meeting strategic milestones and goals, which is what we had before, which was there's billions of dollars of sanctioned money in Iran that would be slowly released. And then a broader regional agreement around certain points. And one of those being the Strait of Hormuz and different other economic agreements, which is what Trump is negotiating for the financial industrial complex. Now, that was a lot of tick for tack and going back and forth, but eventually Iran said, here's our 10-point plan, despite the fact that we were told there's no negotiations. And what was in that? There's non-aggression guarantees. So they want guarantees that Iran will not be going to war again via either Israel or US. This was an agreement with the US. Control of the Strait of Hormuz, significant. We'll cover more of that and why that's so significant, because it effectively ends the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. Enforcement rights maintained. So probably some kind of security guarantees with China, Russia, something neutral, Oman, whatever that may be. Full sanctions removal and compensation for all the war damages. This sets up the framework for the removal of sanctions, and we beta tested that because Trump removed sanctions from certain oil tankers in order to reduce the price of oil. We creep up towards that, which everyone said was impossible. I said would happen as for years now. And then reparations around war damages. This is code word for, you call it reparations, but why don't we do an economic deal that tie us together financially so that there is no reason to enter into military conflict again and go back to the US forever war model via proxy Israel. And then US military withdrawals, which is effectively probably going to be replaced with renegotiation of all the destroyed infrastructure. Ceasefire across all fronts, which was controversial because was Lebanon mentioned? Was Lebanon not mentioned? Well, we didn't get two-way confirmation of a signed agreement, which is what would have happened if this is a real M&A transaction. And if it wasn't theatrical on both sides, we just reveal the contracts, which would have been signed because there'll be lawyers on both sides. So the fact they're not releasing it implies that two parties are contributing to this game, as it were, as well. But effectively, the end of the Bretton Woods, because this would be priced in Chinese yuan, paid for in Bitcoin in some cases, and the port would be controlled, which was previously international waters protected by the US Navy. So effectively, let's just remind ourselves of the bit of history that we've always covered on Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. After World War II, you had the USD gold standard. What that was effectively was that we had the British pound as the world reserve currency prior to World War I. We then had World War I, the Great Depression, 1929 stock market crash, confiscation of gold into America, World War II, the funding of the Soviet Union in World War I via the Bolshevik Revolution that was funded by Wall Street, as well as the funding of the Nazi National Socialist regime that was funded by Wall Street as well as the creation of the Federal Reserve, which was owned by Wall Street. And so you had capitalism, communism, fascism, all the wars, the Cold War, all the stuff. Anyway, we enter into World War II. Most of that gold was transferred to the US military industrial complex base that was built by not being involved in the war. And then you had the reconstruction of Europe into two fronts that set the framework for the Cold War. This turned the European countries that were economically destroyed into US vassals. And then on the Russian side, and then you had strategic tension to justify more and more war. Now, out of that, you had the British ships that were built during the British Empire, the Dutch ships that were built during the Dutch Empire, and as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the pound stopped being the world reserve currency, and rather than having a gold standard, what happened is that basically, because 75% of all gold that was understood was in Fort Knox and in the US, they said everybody trade their currency to dollars. And you can do that at the IMF. So they created the IMF for that. And then your dollars can be converted into gold. And so that set the new framework of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. So, you know, we had the resistance. So we had that order anyway. And we had the IMF and everything that was created and that framework. But the other thing that was negotiated was effectively, in exchange for this, America set the terms. They had United Nations where they could get away with future wars and crimes against humanity and wrap it up in some kind of framework where there was a Security Council with the superpowers at the time, which propped up the dollar and helped maintain this framework. And then they also had agreements to protect all international waters to allow trade to happen. That was protected by the British naval fleets, the Dutch naval fleets, and the American naval fleets. America built the largest naval fleet and protected those international waters, which meant that all trade could be used in their favor. They set up the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF would get everyone into dollar debt. The World Bank would issue loans. The military would do covert operations to destroy countries. Then you would have the post-reconstruction neoliberal. You financialize and securitize every economy. And then you would force countries through regime changes to print their own currency, destroy it, and then lend it back to the US government via US treasuries. Those US treasuries would provide the budget for future wars that would then take those wars and make sure that the money goes back into the US stock market, which created this massive pump and dump Ponzi scheme because the dollar is debt. The Fed the Fed socializes losses and privatizes gains. The banks get to print the money, but there's never enough money to pay off the debt because it's all based upon debt. So it's a Ponzi scheme. And every time it goes wrong, the Fed will socialize losses, privatize gains. That creates wealth transfer. You turn all the people into individual debt products through mortgages, credit cards, student loans. You create a Wall Street mechanism for allowing people to allowing businesses to collateralize their stock through the debt markets. And you bankrupt the US government for as long as you can, with now almost $40 trillion of debt. And then you reset the order again, set the new world order when you're at the end of a debt cycle. So that was set up, and that brings us to kind of where we are now. They agreed to protect the international waters. So the Bretton Woods system was propped up by the dollar standard, the debt standard, the export of debt globally, and the ability to implement the military-industrial complex and enforce the waters. Now, this was tested when the Egypt that went through effectively Israel launched a fake false flag war that led to effectively the Egypt taking control of the Suez Canal. And this expelled the British Empire and set the standards. Now, international waters are basically protected by this Bretton Woods system, where you can safe passage for free trade. But the Suez Canal effectively privatized it, led to the expulsion of the British Empire, very similar to what we're seeing with the Strait of Hormuz today. A bit more history. When JFK tried to take on the military-industrial complex, we know what happened to him in 1963. That led to the stealing of the nuclear enrichment over to Israel, set up these different blackmail operations with the CIA, Mossad, MI6. And what happened in order to bankrupt the US government at that time as they were setting up? Well, we were in a Vietnamese war, which effectively led to the default of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order gold standard. Because now in this 1971 Nixon shock, you could no longer convert your dollars into gold, and the gold standard effectively entered into a default. So now we entered into a debt standard. So what did you need to do? Well, in 1973, the CIA, I believe the CIA, and many people do believe, assassinated King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and created the petrodollar. This was done at the same time as a Yom Kippur War, and the Yom Kippur War was Israel. And as a result of the atrocities in Palestine and various other things, we had this escalation, and King Faisal did an oil embargo, which created an oil shock and stagflation that followed. This was a significantly less oil shock than the one we're getting from the Strait of Hormuz. But anyway, we had that oil shock that led to the assassination of King Faisal and the agreement of the petrodollar. Now, at this time, George Bush set up Safari Club, which was a covert operation with the regime change Saudi Arabia, with Saudi intelligence, US intelligence, Israeli intelligence. No, they were out of it, but then different intelligence network that effectively led to the environment of 9/11 that was done via those intelligence network that justified all the wars that followed: Iraq, Sudan, Libya, eventually Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and all the different wars that followed. And that was effectively to prop up this petrodollar system, continue the forever war, ensure that the money was coming back to purchase US bonds. That kind of brings us to where we are right now. And that was my long-term thesis. What happened? America became an energy exporter. So now they're competing. So therefore, the petrodollar switched from Saudi buying US bonds to Saudi buying US equities. That changed the influence and dynamics of the network, because where was Saudi's money coming from? Oil sales to China, their number one customer, obviously more people as well. So China started funding the sovereign wealth funds. The sovereign wealth funds would purchase equities, and we had this new transnational capital based upon the manufacturing base of China. We had China join the World Trade Agreement. This is when the manufacturing base of US destroyed the military industrial complex, where it became dependent upon China for its components. And China became the manufacturing base, bringing us to where we are right now. China then set up the Belt and Road Initiative, started building infrastructure and new ports and new trade routes across the world, across Africa, across the Middle East, across Asia. And basically, the enforcement mechanism of the US military industrial complex became dependent upon China. And so this is the moment I think Trump was installed in order to reset the world order via tariffs, destroy all the institutions that propped up the dollar, and then escalate a war that leads to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and breaks it. And that is where we are today. So yeah, I think it was in week 2, we covered the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the global reset. So what have we seen this week? Effectively, the strait is closed to anybody other than somebody that negotiates with Iran. And Iran has said, if you want to negotiate a deal, they accept Bitcoin. They also accepted Tether stablecoin at the time, but that was frozen. That was frozen because Genius Act implemented regulations that stated you have to comply with OFAC in these stable coins. And so Tether had to freeze it. And so they stopped using Tether as a stable coin because of the freeze function and started accepting Bitcoin too. Now, please, this is not legal advice around how to circumvent sanctions. Right now, sanctions have been removed for certain activities. And so therefore, a legal Bitcoin transaction can purchase unsanctioned oil from Iran if you negotiate a deal. Not legal advice. This is not about any type of mechanism. You have to follow the law within your country. However, that's what is effectively happened right now. And what is the transaction denominated in? Chinese yuan. So you can pay with Chinese yuan. Effectively, this is chipping away. You can also pay in your local currency. It could be denominated in dollars, but you can't settle in dollars, is the terms. And so this is basically this is the model, as it were, for a post World War II Bretton Woods order. Now, what does this mean? If this can be enforced, it changes international law that was enforced by the Bretton Woods system, because now you can take international waters, and the countries that are in proximity to those international waters can charge a toll and take control. Obviously, that has implication for the Gulf countries and everyone around it. And they don't want Iran to be a superpower. But who is the second largest trade partner of Iran after China? UAE. So if UAE is effectively the largest trade partner of Iran, and allegedly they're in a battle for survival right now because allegedly UAE is an Israeli shill, the narratives we're fed don't quite make sense. Because why haven't they launched a trade war? Because I believe this is a faction of power with the financial industrial complex within Iran that is aligned with China's plan, which normalizes with the Gulf Cooperation Council in order to expel the US, weaken the Zionist military industrial complex project. The media campaign with Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, various other factions of power is weakening radical Zionist neocons within the US. And what did Trump do? He lashed out at them on Truth Social this week. And then you have obviously the highest level of IRGC, which are revealing themselves by the retaliation campaigns and going through decapitation until eventually we get everyone agreeing on a deal. Now, if for the first time, because the only way that Egypt was able to get to charge a toll was by building a canal and charging for the canal rather than the international waters. But if now we get this done for international waters, that has implications all around the world for previous colonized islands like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, all the victims of post-colonial world, and Singapore built its way out. But if this model works in the Strait of Hormuz, why do you think we've had all these battles and settlements within Yemen that controls the Red Sea, as well as Somaliland separatists with Somalia, that UAE has those strategic ports, as well as the Strait of Hormuz? The area is being divided up in a post-World War II Bretton Woods order. And the FIC want in. So they vassalize deals with UAE, weaken UAE so that you've got leverage to get your part of the port for BlackRock's portfolio companies. You got the same with Saudi Arabia by doing a deal between Yemen, Houthis, and Saudi. And then you got the same in the Strait of Hormuz with Iran, and you have a war to manage that transition and destroy the assets of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. So with that in mind, we're going to go a little bit deeper. Who benefits from it? Exactly, because the media is not telling you the right story, and none of the social media that I've seen is getting this right according to my analysis, because once we understand this, we know how to protect ourselves. So now that we're on the negotiation phase, I'm going to play one of the AI movies that goes through the Iranian propaganda side of what these negotiations are kind of pinned upon. And we've been covering lots of the Epstein files and various other things over way before the Epstein files was released, and how they prop up these leverage networks. So let's take a little bit of break, go to the AI movie, and we'll come back with the final parts.
Help! We need backup!
You can do it, baby!
Okay, that's enough!
You've got 10 seconds. Believe me, you don't want this. 5 seconds. Very serious situation. 3. I'm ready.
One last chance! You know what? Forget it. Let's do this the smart way. We talk. Okay. Let's make a deal. That's a good point. I'll take it. Best negotiation I had today.
Okay, so what's the current position that we're in during week 6? Effectively, China has brokered the framework that effectively has made what is being negotiated in Pakistan. And America accepted Iran's terms. And so, but it was done with ambiguous language so that it could enter into a 2-week negotiation. Now, Trump calls it effectively a workable basis publicly on Truth Social, and saying, and it pointed towards the 10-point plan. Then we get this little shenanigans back and forth saying we put the original 10-point plan in the bin and Iran sent us a new plan and we didn't agree to that plan. So we end up back in what was effectively a ceasefire and then an additional escalation cycle. But I personally obviously have said all along that the outcome is already shaped, but now we have to go through the staging process and the final act. So I believe, what do you do when you're negotiating the final points, when it's very intense? Well, the negotiations are around who's going to control the Strait of Hormuz. That's the real thing. Because they're not just going to hand it over to Iran on their own. there was already concessions that it would go to. Some of it would be Oman, if it can happen at all. There's questions around international law here as well. But immediately, the Gulf countries aren't going to be happy with that. And there is leverage there, although some people are framing Iran's got all the leverage, US has got all the leverage. That's not true. There's a lot of other parties in this agreement. Does China want Iran to have all the power? No, it wants to spread the power across a lot of its countries that it's buying this oil from, including Saudi Arabia, including all the other UAE and various other interests in Qatar. And so you probably, in the end, there will be some kind of private interest by one of the BlackRock portfolio companies, or maybe DP World in Dubai, and maybe even some Chinese interests via a covert investment infrastructure into one of these Dubai companies or Saudi Aramco, or any of these companies. But on the front end, there's probably going to be an agreement that ties all the interested parties together via this new war order. Now, effectively, that is China and American private interest at the very top level. Underneath that, you got transnational capital, military industrial complex. And under that, you got all the proxy battles. And under that, this goes all the way down. But this is a resetting of the world order. Now, on this front, you need to leave one thing out to negotiate. Again, humanitarian hat, analytical hat. Humanitarian hat, Israel has always used civilian targets to kill people in order to get escalation and additional negotiation power for its proxy US military industrial complex, and all the factions of transnational military industrial complex, including Britain, Germany, France, Israel, and America. And so all eyes turn to the agreement being agreed, but what was the one thing that broke the ceasefire, or the ceasefire that never really held? It was around Lebanon. And so this, I believe, is the final act, assuming that the pragmatic version of Iran that is going to lead the next order with the reformist or the IRGC that is on board with this China plan is already live now. Then that will make this the final act. And we'll keep covering it until we know what actually happened as well. But Hezbollah, again, humanitarian hat versus reality versus analytical. In this world order, Hezbollah is no longer an asset. It was an asset to Iran when it needed leverage to renegotiate the removal of sanctions. It was a resistance against an Israeli invasion. But if Israel's being reformed, then Lebanon needs to integrate Hezbollah into the state army. No easy task. There are people that won't be on board with that. And then there is agreement that will lead to an integration of Hezbollah into the political process and the military process. But the point here is that if Iran is no longer backing resistance, because the mission is now state stability, regional stability through economic agreements, then we need something that maintains the credibility of Iran in terms of backing its resistance, Israel in terms of protecting its borders, and America in terms of looking strong while it's retreating to a regional power, as well as Lebanese interest, which integrates into France's interest. And we got a pivot from France leading up to this. It's no coincidence that when Bahrain put forward the ceasefire agreement, there were 3 objections from the UN Security Council: China, Russia, and France. France then came into Lebanon. France was one of the people that received Iranian shipments to deal with their energy crisis. And France effectively started changing its allegiances based upon its Lebanese interests. And then we get this escalation. So you can see the lead up to where we're actually getting. But in this new world order, effectively in regional stability, the proxies are no longer assets, because the military doesn't have, Israel exists because of its justification of always being attacked. So it would create the environment that would lead to the attack. And then Iran would create the resistance, and that created the strategic tension that created the forever war. The forever war propped up the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, assured that energy couldn't unify and go eastwards. And therefore, you needed a continual state of war to prop up the system and the petrodollar and enforce it. But under this new model, Hezbollah's a liability. So what does Iran's pragmatists aim to achieve right now? The end of the forever war strategic tension, secure sanction relief, renegotiate any of the economic opening up of markets in order to set the framework, which in the future will probably be energy pipelines from Iran via the GCC, funded or built by China with financial industrial complex infrastructure in order to economically tie everyone together. And in the original negotiation that was announced by Arachi of IRGC and confirmed by the Iranian government, Preshmirov, sorry, I always forget that name and get it wrong. Anyway, I believe that Lebanon was left as a deliberate negotiation chip. It sets, I don't think it's a red line, but it is the framework by which to manage this transition. And it led to the escalation cycle of effectively a situation that gets so unbearable that everyone has the narrative to go towards the three-way victory. So what is actually happening is Iran is effectively has manufactured controlled outrage because it's unacceptable to leave Hezbollah. And so it's, they're trying to prevent escalation publicly. Hezbollah is basically being degraded because Israel launched a brutal attack, civilian targets as well as Hezbollah. Now, Israel can only do it from the plains, from above. Whenever they do a ground invasion, Hezbollah weakens Israel. And so Hezbollah allegedly has taken out over 100 tanks. There's been a lot of unreported IDF deaths. And every time Israel has done a ground invasion, Hezbollah has kicked ass. And so we're getting, these weakening of Israel IDF assets through ground invasion and weakening of Hezbollah through air forces and the Israeli air forces, which is creating the environment for economic weakness in Israel and a framework for the integration of Hezbollah into the Lebanese army eventually, which will be enforced through some kind of tiered agreement moving forward. So Lebanon is now asserting sovereignty, and we're getting this massive escalation from Israel, where it's effectively getting rid of any strategic locations that are needed for any of the future ports and portway and pathways that are going to be built as well in the Build Back Better phase. So basically, Israel is removing the proxy burden of Iran, and it's almost like an outsourcing agreement with a forward-facing story in order to manage this transition without having a revolution and an uprising that would create regional instability that would then lead to the forever war as well. So the transition form is effectively a proxy war to basically proxy assets to state assets. And that is the deal that I think we're witnessing right now. Okay, so that is what I think the final act is. Now, this could go on for quite some time. We don't know how long that takes. But I also believe, think about it. What does the US want? The US is in an economic crisis right now. If the Strait opens, because all the reasons that we've covered in the market updates, every time the price of oil gets to $115, it increases the likelihood of a depression in the fallout supply chain. Every time the US debt yield on the 10-year treasury gets to 4.5, that creates something that could break in the mortgage market that breaks the banking and the private credit market. The weaker the GCC gets, the less AI investment they're going to get from the sovereign wealth funds. The closer the 30-year bond gets to the 5%, the less likely US is able to roll over its debt. If it can't roll over its debt, then the Fed is the last buyer, and the Fed leads to the big print, which strategically weakens the dollar again and ends the dollar as world reserve currency as it gets more distressed. And then you have the breaking of the petrodollar, the Japan carry trade, the euro dollar, and everything we've talked about. So you can't allow it to go above those points, but you want to keep it at those points to have the managed transition. And you want to get the price of oil lower once the deal is actually settled, but higher than where it previously was, to create the K-shaped economy, asset stripping exercise, global reset, where massive concentration of wealth, as happens in every crisis, like the 2008 financial crisis or long-term capital management or the Russia-Ukraine war or COVID, is always concentrating wealth upwards into those that own the asset and fewer hands. But anyway, so who actually benefits? Because some people are pushing out the US benefits and therefore Trump is playing 5D chess. But that, if you think Trump works for the American people, doesn't add up. If Trump is a puppet for the financial industrial complex, technical industrial complex, and military industrial complex, it makes perfect sense, which is burden the Americans with debt, do Operation Warp Speed 2.0, further this along like he did with COVID, and do the same for this massive wealth transfer as a result of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the global reset. So we have to ask ourselves the question to understand this. Inadvertently or coordinated, you pick. I believe there's coordination. I also believe there's inadvertent benefit that adjusts based upon capital flows and is managed by asset managers like Transnational Capital, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Who benefits? The US private sector, but a tiny subset of it. 1% of the US economy is energy sales by private companies. They're the primary winner. The consumer loses. 60% of the US economy is consumption. 50% of all consumption is by the wealthiest 10%. If you push up prices, the lower 50%, you get demand destruction. Recession caused the big print and the global reset. And the wealthy people, they're inelastic. They'll pay whatever. But the mid-class, that need to borrow against their stock, if you get destruction in the stock market, you also get the wiping out of the middle class. And through any of these military operations, you remove some of the aging population. So you can see how this works in their spreadsheets and formulas. So the primary winner is a few companies in the US. They profit because effectively, in a debt-based Ponzi scheme with a big print, you privatize the losses and socialize all of the gains and the benefit for the key businesses. So who's going to benefit from it? Cheniere Energy is getting all of the LNG export contracts as a result of it. ExxonMobil, they're getting a bunch of the different types of contracts, and they are shareholders in the Golden Pass energy LNG infrastructure. 70% owned by Qatar, 30% owned by Exxon. They were timed perfectly to benefit from this as well. Chevron obviously is going to be getting much higher oil prices globally as a result of the old US empire. So this is more power. BlackRock's assets under administration have gone up from $12 trillion to $14 trillion. Transnational capital, all of the sovereign wealth funds, all of the investment banks, they're managing $25 trillion of wealth through BlackRock's Aladdin technology. So they're doing scenario planning through their AI. They go into BlackRock's Aladdin, say, how do I scenario plan for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz? It will tell you where to allocate the capital. And most of it, a lot of it has been done algorithmically through integration into BlackRock's ETF structures. So now we're getting these structural reallocations of capital based upon BlackRock's Aladdin technology, based upon the sovereign wealth funds and transnational capital plugging into BlackRock's funds, who also benefit from these managed portfolios and scenario planning. So they get the higher oil price leverage in negotiating all these points because everyone's going through an energy crisis. Halliburton stroke SLB, they're going to be doing reconstruction phase, most likely, from the US side. But there is also nationalized interest. So remember, America is controlled by private interests, financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, technical industrial complex. Of course, there is massive AI bailout that will receive the big print. Now, China's building the AI, so you get all the podcasts saying China's going to win the AI race, China's going to win the AI race. That creates the narrative and justification for the big print. The global reset enforces the $7 to $10 trillion guaranteed big print. That's wealth conversation, socializes losses, privatized gains. If the Gulf countries can't invest, then you create an AI crisis through higher energy prices, at the same time as AI and robotics becoming a strategic national security narrative. Trump then increases the budget for the military from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. Military companies do great. Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Boeing. Palantir gets their AI technology. Elon gets to build his AI robotics social credit score. When housing becomes unaffordable, you got Tesla houses, which is a surveillance state house. When cars and energy becomes unaffordable, you get automated cars via Tesla and other players as well, obviously. Then you get everyone talking on social media. X becomes your social credit score, which becomes a financial app, which integrates with Genius Act, which integrates into Suspicious Activity Report and the Patriot Act and everything, and the Genius Act. You got a big, beautiful bill that allocated all the budgets over to those few companies, and the American people are broke. They pay the bill, and you socialize the losses and privatize the gains. Now you have the narrative for energy lockdowns globally, energy crisis, COVID all over again, combined with the 1973 oil embargo stagflation, combined with the big print bailout of 2008, combined with the breaking of the private credit market, like long-term capital management that leads to force majeure contracts. And you've got the almighty biggest print that we've likely ever seen, combined with the regime change at the Federal Reserve to somebody that might be hawkish. And if he's hawkish, he can destroy the US empire if they wanted to do that, or he can put those interest rates low in order to strip all the lost assets in the K-shaped economy while ETF and BlackRock manages capital outflows. At the end of this war, we go back to the strategic weakening of the dollar, the outperformance of foreign currencies against the dollar, which strengthened during this war. But then if we get the end, we go back, and foreign stock markets outperforming the S&P in order to manage a transition and asset strip the West, concentrate power. Trump did a great job. Who else benefits? What about those that nationalize their energy? Who's that? Higher oil prices benefits those countries that did that. There's only really a couple of them, and they got sanction relief. So you got higher oil prices that increased your national energy, and those countries got sanction relief while in a proxy war with America. And that is Russia and Iran. They are both members of BRICS. Trump is a BRICS salesperson, and he's deconstructing everything that propped up the petrodollar in the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. That's why he was installed. And it started with tariffs, as I said, that drove everyone to China and renegotiated every agreement, reset everything. And then you get the environment where you get sanctions relief. So the structural upside of everything benefits Iran and Russia, while simultaneously weakening Israel infrastructure, Iran infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt by who? China. You get this? Leading up to the China summit, which was meant to be in April, but got extended till May, which is where Xi Jinping and Trump have their meeting. What did China do leading up to this? Built the largest reserves of everything in the world. And with their Belt and Road Initiative, started selling down their US treasuries from 1.4 trillion to now about 650 billion. They didn't want to break the dollar. They wanted the dollar to continue on its path, weaken it, manage the transition, while building the manufacturing base and investing in Africa and all the countries that have populations. Now, China has its own demographic issue, the one-child policy. That's going to get worse and worse. So they're using AI at the state level to build AI and robotics. They're not doing what America's doing, building AI and robotics to commercialize it, but the government will pay for it through the big print. So you're doing the China model, but you're privatizing the gains. China keeps the gains in order to build the manufacturing base within China so that it can deal with this demographic issue. But where's the demand going to come from when you have structural unemployment in both? It's going to come from the countries that still have populations. Africa, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, many of the African nations, some of the Middle Eastern nations, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. So you're creating structural demand in the Middle East. Why do you think BlackRock is managing multipolarity? Because they don't have the population. And so instead, they're manufacturing the police and surveillance state in the West, which was built upon the China model. If you're an asset manager, that's what you do. And you do that with a multi-decade strategy by controlling access to capital. And you need wars in order to manage that global reset, usher in the police and surveillance state, build up the countries with population growth, and build a surveillance state in the regions with population shrinkage and an aging population. The aging population has to choose between eating and heating in order to deal with the pension crisis, because those liabilities are going up and up and up. And the bondholders are controlling the 30-year yield. The banks are controlling the 10-year yield. And big oil and the deep state and the military industrial complex are controlling the oil prices and all the different world commodity prices, while the technical industrial complex is building the police and surveillance state. You get what's happening here? The Western governments have been captured. This is the model in play. And this is how they manage a transition. China built the largest reserves in the world so that they're prepared. They originally said China's going to run out within 3 weeks. Then they said 3 months. Then they said 6 months. Then they said a year. China's fully prepared. And what happened with Singapore, who may be negotiating their port in the New World Order? China sent 2 million barrels of oil over to Singapore. Russia's bailing out Indonesia and Malaysia in their energy crisis. And China's going to be rebuilding what used to be called the Middle East and will now likely be West Asia forever. And what is Israel doing? Pariah state in the West, aligning with India. While UAE gets vassalized into the financial industrial complex, so does Israel, so does India, so that India can become the strategic tension in a competing manufacturing base with China. And UAE becomes the FIC outpost, while Saudi Arabia becomes the global leader within the GCC. The ports are renegotiated so that US can exit. The defense contracts are renegotiated so that the US can exit. and they're likely to be renegotiated eastwards with compensation to the private financial industrial complex that controls the West, that is funding the police and surveillance state and doing the closed border, open border policy for Palantir, for Tesla, for David Sachs, the PayPal mafia that implemented the Genius Act and the AI infrastructure and the modern Operation Warp Speed 2.0. Anyway, this is absorbing the global transition while transitioning to a multipolar world order. So I'm going to just summarize the final parts of it. But just before we do that, let's go to one more AI video that kind of shows you how the Zionism as an ideology is becoming a toxic asset as you build the acquisition strategy for Israel and the asset stripping of America and the West. And Trump goes deeper and deeper and deeper into Zionism, which is removing his popularity, ready for the regime change, ready for Netanyahu being blamed for October the 7th, ready for a GCC puppet government in Israel, and that will usher in for the financial industrial complex. So what does Netanyahu need? He needs a war so that he can buy more time because he's negotiating his exit and his next court process starts this weekend. And he's got the genocide case in the international court. So Trump is saying, doing everything he can to help Netanyahu while sanctioning the international courts, which weakens America because this was part of the United Nations structure that propped up the post-World War II Bretton Woods. And what does Netanyahu need? He needs another war because the Strait has to open yesterday in order to manage these oil prices. The negotiations are probably done. And so they can't have a war with Iran because the Strait can't open. So they need a war with Lebanon in order to buy the time and serve the strategic goals, which is why likely my prediction is that Lebanon will be taken out of the agreement. And they need to create the type of environment that makes that acceptable with the three-way victory narrative to do the exit, open the Strait, and the negotiation that is obviously happening around the Strait with everyone pulling their levers as well. So with that in mind, I'd love to put a bit of trolling that was done by Iran on the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. Let's go over to that AI video, then we'll close up and go to part 2, the big print.
Don't let go. Whatever you do, don't let go!
I'll never let go, Donnie.
I'm flying, Don! I'm flying!
Please! Please, I need another trillion or so! Anything for you, BB.
Okay, let's wrap all this up together anyway in terms of what comes next, and then let's do a little summary and point you to where you can get more information if you haven't had enough already. And then we'll be moving over to part 2, where I will be doing my session with the author of the big print, Lawrence Lepard. So what do I expect to happen next? Well, I think we're going to see some continued staged escalation. And by stage, humanitarian hat, tragedy, crimes against humanity. Analytical hat, negotiated outcome, moving towards the final stage. Staged escalation. There's going to be a lot of negotiation optics. There's going to be people saying, we're not negotiating. There's going to be people, saying, yeah, the deal's off, the deal's on. The negotiations, I believe, have been continual throughout this whole process, even before the war begun. And this war was part of that negotiation of executing what was agreed. So lots more negotiation optics. We may get more delays. We may get more weeks that we have to do this. But directionally, I think unless something changes, I don't need to analyze every single moment, and I may get some of the moments wrong. But directionally, I think we're headed based upon following the money and who benefits and how the world actually works in terms of power dynamics. So the final agreement that will eventually be announced that will transition the West Asia into regional stability will look something like this. Eventually, there will be full Iran integration and full normalization. Eventually, I don't know how long that's going to take. It will be tiered, maybe. There's a gradual transition, but nothing stops this train. This will be a US partial withdrawal where effectively you're switching the military industrial complex privatized interest with the financial industrial complex privatized interest. They may get defense contracts, AI contracts, those types of things, but it's not going to be rebuilt the same. It's not going to be the Gulf countries, publicly very angry. And this has obviously been a big hit to the economy for those that weren't in the inner circle of the highest level of negotiations. There will be massive regional reconstruction contracts by local organizations, probably within Saudi and various other companies in UAE and stuff like that. That will make up for some of the economic losses. And it will be built by Asian populations in Southeast Asia, as well as maybe some Chinese reconstruction contracts as well. It will end the US forever war model in the region, not the forever war model. There is always forever wars, but in the region, they've negotiated the exit through the financial industrial complex, I believe. They'll be handing over US assets over to the FIC players that are involved in these negotiations. And they'll be building the technical industrial complex, police and surveillance state in the West, but also providing infrastructure for AI data centers that's probably powered by nuclear energy that will obviously have their own security, internal sovereign infrastructure as well, which we need to keep an eye on all around the world. That's a global trend, both on the China side and the US side. It will be the end of the US-dominated United Nations. Maybe UN falls. Maybe it moves out of America. Maybe it gets on without America contributing. Maybe they're not a part of the Security Council. Whatever happens to the UN, expect a managed transition away from the Bretton Woods version. The end of the US-dominated NATO, which was a sales strategy for the US military-industrial complex. Rather than America contributing to prop up the empire, it would just use it as a sales strategy, so hand over all the profits from wars up to the military-industrial complex in Germany, in the UK, in France, in mainly America, and some of the Israeli contracts will be integrated into the GCC infrastructure as well. And US dominant trade ports. So we may get this model based upon the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe it stands up in international law, maybe it doesn't. But if we do get this model, then I think we're going to see more and more of those around all of the strategic choke points and trade ports around the world in a multipolar empire that will prop up multipolar currencies. So based upon geography and proximity to geography, they will be transacted in currencies. So that means we don't get this structural bid always over to the dollar. We've already seen the end of US-dominated USAID and National Endowment of Democracy. These were the deep state operations that propped up the dollar, the regime changes, the currency wars that enforced dollar dominance. By exposing that corruption early on, that effectively had a repackaging, which was a signal to the world that things are changing. Weakened the petrodollar, which obviously this has achieved. Now, the Iran war strengthened it if America was going to go in, occupy, put 4 million troops in, take the oil, and then price it in dollar. But the MAGA narrative, the Q-tards, think that's happening. in order to strengthen the petrodollar as well as the stablecoin narrative. But what's really happening is the petrodollar strengthened throughout the Iran war. But as soon as the war ends, you'll get dollar price down back to the weakening of the dollar. Yields will become more sustainable. And you buy more time to extract more wealth from the West as well. You weaken the Japan carry trade by Japan increasing their rates in an oil crisis and a inflation crisis. So then they can increase those rates, which breaks the Japan carry trade. And 40% of all bond auctions are being done by hedge funds using effectively borrowed money and derivatives contracts 100-to-1 leverage. That breaks that source of funding, which pushes to the big print, where the Fed socialized the losses, privatized the gains for bondholders. You weaken the euro dollar by allowing some of the relationship into LNG contracts, but you vassalize Europe further and further and further into a weakened state, so that you can just extract as much as you can, but you weaken the euro dollar effectively. You do continual sanction on those that use USDT stablecoins via the Genius Act. You do continual, we've already had the weakening of US treasuries over to gold as the #1 reserve asset for central banks. You continue destabilizing the stability of trades with US so that everybody continues, and I think there's a lot more to go with gold. You do continual pricing in a multipolar world into Bitcoin transactions, which creates structural demand. You create the environment of a police state, so everyone wants to self-custody, so that those that want to exit the system can do that. Use tariffs in order to push business over to China and away from America. You use basically, that pushes everyone to you push narrative that effectively makes America look like an unstable trading partner and China look like a stable trading partner. And then all of this, by my estimation, needs to be wrapped up with Lebanon as the final front, way before May the 14th for the China summit, where Xi Jinping and Trump have that meeting, which will mark the end of the Bretton Woods order, particularly if a deal is done via the Strait of Hormuz. Then you'll have a global decolonization process from the US empire, and it will become the regional hegemon with Europe, Canada, and the Northern Hemisphere effectively via the West. So this is not about who wins the war. Everyone will declare that they won the war. Israel will say they won the war. America will say they won the war. Iran will say they won the war. IRGC will still be maintained, but pragmatic, aligned with China BRICS and the regional stability plan. It's all about, effectively, who captures energy markets. Iran will have some, the Gulf countries will have some, and the private interest across the West, as well as Guyana, Brazil. There's what happens with Australia, various other things. Russia. Whoever maintains the energy routes ends up with a significant chunk of the control in this new world order. Who controls reconstruction contracts? Whoever invests ends up with the strategic equity and partnership in those that reconstruct the energy contracts. Who shapes the next global order is determined by these new energy, these new ports, and these new infrastructure redevelopment. What is the West going to do when it is increasingly asset stripped? As I've been preparing people all along, there's only one option: big print. Print more money, get the Federal Reserve to buy the treasuries as less and less foreign investors buy them. And then maybe you reconstruct an environment of lower interest rates and enforce them on pensioners, enforce these subsidized rates through some kind of martial law or whatever you need to do. But those bonds will be purchased by Americans and by the Federal Reserve. And the beneficial owners the bondholders that hold the old treasuries will asset strip, and the ones that get the low artificial subsidized ones will effectively be the bag holders as we manage this transition. And if that breaks, then we end up in a scenario that people often talk about called the Great Taking. You can look it up. Maybe I'll end up doing a panel discussion or something with the guy that wrote the Great Taking book as well. But effectively, there has been legal changes where the only assets you own are the ones in self-custody. Because even if you own shares, the DTCC, the clearinghouse, holds a beneficiary record of the broker that owns it. And if the broker owns it and you don't own it and the DTCC owns it, then who owns the actual commodity, the actual underlying assets? The custodians. Who are the custodians? The ETFs. So if you did the Great Taking, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if the big print stops working, you effectively do bail-ins. You do socializing losses and privatizing gains in the big print, but eventually, who has the assets wins. Self-custody. That is the Bitcoin story. That is the gold story. And you need to be clear of your custodial relationships in all your financial transactions. That's what I'm trying to prepare everybody for. Have a 10-year plan. Start today. Become more sovereign. Own assets in self-custody. Boycott the Federal Reserve System by owning Bitcoin in self-custody. Boycott BlackRock X, own gold in self-custody, Bitcoin in self-custody. Boycott the banks by not using your assets as collateral so they own them during big prints and great takings. Spend local, really important. Your local infrastructure will determine your quality of life. You as an individual, your family, and your local people, your local farmers, your local supply chains. Push all your money to them, not to global multinational institutions. Start questioning your supply chains. How do we work together to solve our supply chains? Now is the time to start thinking about, why is fertilizer coming from the Middle East anyway? Because it's poisoned petrochemicals from big oil. So why do we need to import fertilizers from a country that's dominated by sand? Is that natural? Am I poisoning myself? Is this why there's a cancer pandemic? Am I contributing to helping them solve their pension crisis by being unhealthy, by being psychologically unstable? Am I contributing to the AI and robotics trade by not having children? Am I beating inflation by holding the assets that beat this? Am I spending less than I earn and investing the difference? What am I investing in? Who owns it? What's the custody relationship? Am I dependent upon one country? Do I have my assets in another jurisdiction through title? Do I have a passport in another country? Or have I got everything exposed to one job, one income stream, one country that may end up confiscating my assets? I know it's overwhelming, but this is why you start now. You don't get perfect. You just chip away each and every month and make sure that you're working on your contingency strategies. So anyway, I know this is a lot of information. What I do is I break this down into blogs on SimonDixon.com, where if you haven't got time to watch them all, I do AI videos into 5-minute summaries and 15-minute summaries. If you didn't watch weeks 1 to 6, let me just do a little bit of a recap. I started doing analysis like this every single week. Iran week 1 was the opening shock. Iran war week 2 was the escalation phase. Iran war week 3 was the settlement phase before anyone was calling it a settlement. Iran war week 4 was the Build Back Better phrase, the destruction that needs to happen for the Build Back Better. The Iran war week 5 was by saying the market now determines the outcome and the duration, and that you can see the reset and the global reset based upon the market that's setting the parameter in the bond market and the oil market. Iran war week 6, which is what we covered this week, is the final acts. We discussed Lebanon being the bargaining chip and the end game that actually comes from here. And always remember, analytical hat off, humanitarian hat off. This system needs to die. It is crimes against humanity. You need to exit. If you contribute to this system with your money, boycott it. The crimes against humanity that are happening in Lebanon and Gaza right now, the people that are dying in America through this asset stripping exercise, the West by our governments not favoring people, Iranians that are just on the wrong side of sanctions. I mean, effectively, even the real terrorists, the IDF, that are doing this, they're subject to a bunch of brainwashing. Remember that interview I did with the Bitcoiner that's an ex-IDF soldier? You know, we had that conversation with religion as being weaponized. We are all humans. This is humanity. This is a humanitarian crisis. And all they care about is us voting with our money. That's what we do. We boycott, we go local, and we get more human by having more human relationships. Starts with ourselves, then goes to our loved ones, then goes to our local community. Prioritize in that order, and you'll get through whatever they throw, because at the other side, they're going to need people. Always remember, you're alive at one of the craziest, interesting, and most exciting times for some people, but for less and less people. Some are going to get hurt, others are going to get wrecked. I want you to be on the right side of this change. I want you to have the protection and sovereignty to be able to do it peace, love, and unity, because the others ain't going to be able to do that. We're going through this transition together, and I'll keep covering every week my analysis. Follow the money so that you can get ahead, years ahead of those that are following the media and the politicians. Opt out of politics. You don't vote your way out of it. It makes no difference whatsoever. The Chinese are kicking ass right now because they're not wasting time in a political system that they think they can change. You can't change this. The only way you can change this is by becoming the lobby. You become the lobby by becoming rich. You become rich by beating the system, follow the money, understand the game, and then you can do with your money how to really change the world. That's how you change things. And you need 10 years to do it. So if you've not been doing it, for years, I've got more and more people that are sovereign right now, Iranians that weren't being killed because they were sovereign and they were able to take their Bitcoin with them as currencies were being destroyed. All around the world, I got messages from people because I've been sharing this ever since Bitcoin was $3 for people to own more Bitcoin this month than last month, learn self-custody, run a node, hedge with Bitcoin, with gold in self-custody, then get your structuring right. Do everything legally, do it by the book. It's a spiritual mission. We will be judged for how we act. We ain't going to solve the world, but shit's going to be thrown at us, and we either do more good or do more bad. That's the only choice. Perfection is the enemy. You're not going to get this perfect. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn. There's only two choices, better or worse. And when they test me, when I have those easy decisions to go down an evil path, am I going to be taken down a compromise network because we're being tested? When your money goes into good, I found that it gets 10x the return. 10x the return. There is a spiritual energy with your money. When it goes bad, it takes you back. And it comes back to bite. So with that in mind, let's transition to part two. Part two is the big print beginning. What that looks like with the author of the big print. I was invited onto BTC sessions with myself and Lawrence Lepard. And we went through everything from war, markets, the big print, the military industrial complex, the reset, and an alternative perspective on what this looks like. So enjoy part two, enjoy the interview, and I'll see you next week. Peace.
All right. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. There's a lot to talk about today. It seems like things are maybe getting a little bit worse out there. Simon, I do want to get your latest updates on what you're seeing in the Iran conflict. Before we get there, Larry, for those that might not be aware, you are perhaps a little bit, maybe a couple of years older than me. And I'm curious what you're seeing out there, what your read on the situation is, and if it resembles anything in history that you've seen before.
It's got a little bit of everything, right? I mean, it's a little bit Cuban Missile Crisis-like. I was only 6 years old at the time. It's got some 9/11 elements to it, and etc. I think we're going to talk about all this, but I think one of the most interesting things is kind of the question of who's pulling the strings here and who's really calling the shots. And I think Simon would agree with me, and I've watched a lot of his videos, have a lot of respect for the geopolitical analysis he's done. I know that there are shadow forces in the world that, control things and do things that, the actors on the stage are really sometimes just reading a script. And, if you go back and start with, I think the most notable one in my lifetime, I was young, but I remember it very well, was the murder of Kennedy by the CIA. And then, of course, more and more events since then have kind of proven that, I'm not really sure the U.S. president is a sovereign entity. I think he's kind of put there and has to do what he has to do. I'll relate a story. You both were younger when this occurred, but I just remember it like it was yesterday because I thought it was very interesting. If you recall, Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton in the primaries because he was a peace candidate. He talked about shutting down Guantanamo. He talked about, ending all wars. He talked about not using drones. All of it. He was a peaceful guy, and he ran on that, and that's why he won. That's why he beat her. And of course, then we know what happened. He got into office and he reversed all those policies. And I think, what I think happened is, you get elected as he was, and, somebody from the CIA or the military industrial complex comes and has a nice little talk with you and explains how it's really going to be. It says, yeah, okay, the campaign's over now. You've got the position, and here's how it's really going to work. You're going to do exactly what we tell you to do. You can put it in nicer language, do it any way you like, but, and if you do, it's all going to work out, and you're going to have a $16 million house on Martha's Vineyard and, write a $100 million memoir. Or if you don't, you can go the other direction and, you're going to, recall what we did to Kennedy. So, you think about it and you choose one, which direction do you want to go? And I don't think that model has necessarily changed. I think we're kind of seeing it play out real time, today. And so, but I'm very curious to get Simon's take on who we think is pulling Trump's strings and what the next moves are likely to be, because it's goddamn hard. And I have to say, right now I'm feeling pretty, good and confident, and I did my workout this morning and so on and so forth. But to the average person, seeing the president of your country wake up and tweet that, he's going to wipe another country off the map using nuclear weapons. That's disturbing. It's disturbing. It's inappropriate. It's scary. It's fear mongering. And, I get it. This guy likes attention, and this will definitely get him attention. But, my reaction is, shut the fuck up and stop it. It's completely irresponsible, and you're creating fear that doesn't need to be created. It's not good for humankind. So I guess I'll leave that as my introductory statement.
That's a damn good one. So, Simon, who are the actors in this play, and what's your latest take on the current situation, my friend?
Yeah, just a few comments on what you've said. I've been blessed because Bitcoin kind of put me in a position where I was able to retire early, and I invested in a lot of companies, and I kind of decided to unwind all that and just really dig deep into the geopolitical sphere. And it's what got me into Bitcoin in the first place, because I knew that banking was an absolute fraudulent Ponzi scheme. And that's what, helped me find Bitcoin. But it wasn't until I managed to sell my business to Coinbase and just really disconnect from all ties, that I was able to reflect back upon, my investment banking career and how we used to turn companies into structured products, how we used to laden them with debt as a tool for leverage, and just how you would construct what I call financial weapons of mass destruction, and just the complete cycle of a business from Silicon Valley to going public and everything in between. So I was really able to put some time in to model that. At the same time, I was willing to go down conspiracies and really try and figure out, what were behind them. And it's interesting you start at JFK, because I think it's a really interesting starting point. I think, you got to look at the Bank of England to the Fed to really understand like the history, World War I, World War II. But if we really want to tie it into the situation we are at today, it was that regime change from JFK to Lyndon B. Johnson
that really accelerated much of the trends that we're witnessing right now. So JFK was a big critic of the military-industrial complex. He was a big critic of what is now AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, and he wanted them to register as a foreign agent. And if you look at the mobs that were involved in the formation of the CIA, it kind of had a partnership between the post-World War II Hitler regime, as well as the Jewish mob and the Italian mafia. And they really came together and they were a part of what became the CIA. And later this evolved to the quote unquote deep state, really. And you can look through and you can realize that probably 10% of the CIA is about national security. 90% is the profiting from war, building back in order to extract resources, and then building the technology that we're kind of at today for like these police and surveillance state type of things. And I'd say 90% of what the CIA has always done has been for large corporate interests, and their job is effectively to burden the people with as much debt as possible, bankrupt the government, burden people with as much debt as possible, use corporate debt as a leverage mechanism to create these ginormous multinational corporations, and then take it to the end of a debt cycle and then use the military, the financial weapons and the technology weapons to kind of go through this cycle. Now, all of it was involved in JFK because obviously there was the missile threat, the Cuban side. Right now, there is a terrorist attack on Cuba, weaponizing energy. Their hospitals are offline. They're not able to receive energy. That is a civilian attack. People aren't able to travel. They are ill right now. It is an absolute humanitarian crisis in Cuba. They're relying upon biofuels, and they were cut off their energy because they relied upon Venezuela, who was able to circumvent sanctions because they partnered with China, Russia, and Iran that had the leverage to be able to build alternative routes for getting energy to these sanctioned jurisdictions. So we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had the Israeli connection, we had the regime change, because effectively let's call it the mafia, the CIA, Mossad, MI6 at the time, they regime changed JFK, and that led to the stealing of the highly enriched uranium that led to Israel having an illegal nuclear weapon. And that was all as a result of these trafficking routes that happened to the organizations that are now known as the ADL and AIPAC and all that stuff. So really the narrative around financial weapons of mass destruction came around that whole JFK assassination. We then had the 1967 Six-Day War. We had the Vietnamese War that led to the bankruptcy of America, which effectively led to the debt default, where they said no one can convert their dollars to gold anymore. And that led to the 1973 Yom Kippur War with Israel, which led to basically Nixon took America off the gold standard. The Vietnam War bankrupted America as well. And then in the 1973 war, what happened? Well, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia actually did an oil embargo that led to the stagflation. And I believe the CIA and Mossad assassinated King Faisal, which led to effectively the petrodollar. And that is when we had, the removal of the connection to gold. Then we had the petrodollar. Then we enter into this crazy fiat currency standard, where crisis after crisis, we lead to your topic that the only way of solving this is through the big. So it all connects like through that history. But when we ended up with the Iranian Revolution, the history of Iran is effectively one of CIA and MI6 regime change. Iran had a democracy. And in 1953, when British Petroleum didn't want Iran's oil to be nationalized, It replaced the democracy with an installed puppet regime. And we went through all of this history. But around about the Iranian Revolution, we had the Iran-Contra affair, which I think sets the framework up for where we are now. It was very controversial because the CIA released a bunch of documents, and it showed that Iran, Israel, and US were involved in an intelligence operation that led to the Iranian Revolution and a swap of the hostages for weapons that were then trafficked via Israel to Iran, and then Iran would deliver them into Central South America via the Contras. And the CIA was funding these militia groups in order to get the drug trafficking into America that funds the Black Op operations of the CIA. I believe all those operations still exist today. And there is an old guard that kind of relied upon trillions of dollars was printed, war after war, destabilization campaign, when it comes from Libya to Sudan to Iraq to Afghanistan to Sudan, all of the different things. If you think about that entire 40-year history since the Iranian Revolution, Israel and Iran never went to war. But Iran was always 2 weeks away from a nuclear bomb, and Israel was always projecting that Iran is about to attack them. And that led to the justification of all of the different wars, $10 trillion of money printing. But it wasn't until after October the 7th that we had, for the very first time, Iran and Israel actually exchange fires at each other. I believe this is the dismantling of the old guard, which is the military-industrial complex profiting from forever wars in the Middle East. And in order to dismantle that narrative, there are three factions of power that prop it up. One is the whole Zionist Israel, we're protecting the Jews, we recruit the IDF, but really we're creating chaos around the region. The other is the neocon Zionist narrative within America, represented by Lindsey Graham as like a cartoon meme of always justifying war. But then you had the resistance economy that IRGC built, which is the strategic tension. It's the death to America, death to Israel meme that effectively led to the funding of the different proxy groups, and then the justification for this continual state of war and this continual state of destabilization that effectively gave America its global hegemon, prevented the region unifying around their resources, because they knew that if they unified around their resources, they would go eastwards and they would lean into China and they would lean into Russia. And that was unacceptable for the American empire. So, that kind of brings us where we are right now. Who controls
You're
Trump?
suggesting actually that we almost needed the IRGC to exist in order for the system to work in the way they wanted it to work, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So you always have, if you read things like Operation Gladio, which is where this concept of creating militia armies in order to manufacture a fake enemy, like they did during the Cold War and communism. They would always put American armies, because even if you go far back as 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, that was funded by Wall Street, and the same people that were on the Reichsbank in Germany, the Warburg brothers were also the governor of the Federal Reserve, was also funding the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution. And that was the year that the British Empire declared Palestine as a nation, to the Rothschilds, that led to the creation of Israel. The Balfour Declaration, correct. So the Operation Gladio is about, you create strategic tension, you fund militia groups, you manufacture through the media a fake enemy, and then you justify, the trillions of dollars of money printing that results from believing that you're always at a threat. And so IRGC at the hardliner level, Israel in terms of its narrative, and then the military industrial complex in America they provided the narrative that's needed to always believe that you need to print more money and spend more money on the military.
Yeah. So I don't want to go there in this show because we don't have time and it's not really productive, but I'd love to spend an hour with you talking about 9/11 because it seems like a very similar model. But for the sake of the listeners, and because we don't have 10 hours to do this in, I'd be very curious to understand where you think we are now and what, how it's playing. I mean, I completely agree with your view that we're moving to a multipolar world. That's obvious. The dollar has to die, in terms of, the petrodollar has to die, etc. I mean, some would almost arguably say that, this whole Mad King Trump thing is an act in order to have it die and have us get shoved out of the Middle East and go back to a sounder money kind of gold standard. And do you agree with that? And if that's the case, I noticed this morning, you said you weren't very troubled at all by Trump's apocalyptic tweet this morning. I kind of had the same reaction, but I'm not really sure why. But it feels to me, I mean, if you look at what Vance is saying, and he's over, I believe, in Budapest in Hungary, and saying my guess is we're getting set up here for some kind of a peace deal in the next couple of days, and Trump's going to declare an enormous victory and explain why he wants the Nobel. I mean, is that kind of how it feels to you, or how do you see these more recent developments?
Yeah, but I have to have a bit more nuance there because I constantly fluctuate between my humanitarian hat and my analytical hat. Yeah. And both are in complete opposite directions. The deaths are real. The tragedy is real. It's disgusting. It's a humanitarian crisis. But the military industrial complex, they're the type of people that would manufacture weapons that are made specifically for 7-year-old kids that have smaller, there is a zero ethics environment in terms of this manufacturing of war. And so in the humanitarian side, that is real. There were 165 children that were murdered on the first day of the Iran war at a children's school, girls aged between 6 and 12. Those are all real deaths. There was a humanitarian starvation famine campaign in Gaza. These are real human tragedies and disasters. But on the analytical side, there is, in my perspective, real power and fake power. I think we've hit a stage where America and the collective West, through the process of financialization, securitization, globalization, and this debt-based Ponzi scheme that is central banking, have been fully captured by private corporate interests. Now, you sound like a radical lefty or something like that. I'm apolitical. I don't buy into these left versus right narratives or anything like that. People think I've got Trump derangement syndrome, but I also had Biden derangement syndrome and Keir Starmer derangement syndrome and, Clinton derangement syndrome. So whoever the leader is, you kind of get pushed into this team sports. But I believe the West is fully captured when we went into this globalization, America destroyed its manufacturing base. China became the global manufacturing base, and America became energy independent. That broke the whole system because effectively China is needing energy. It buys it from the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and the large energy producers. And then America is now competing with the previous big oil and sovereign wealth funds. So what happened is Saudi effectively stopped buying treasuries and started buying equities. And so now America has effectively sold $65 trillion of its assets to foreign sovereign wealth funds and foreign investors. And there is a financial industrial complex that I call transnational capital. It consists of institutions like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. It consists of partnerships with sovereign wealth funds, Norway in Europe, Singapore in ASEAN, the Gulf countries in the Middle East. And there is one country that is sovereign to a degree right now, which is the country where no corporation is bigger than their government, the CCP. They have a state banking system. They have a manufacturing base, and they're trying to become oil independent or energy independent through alternative renewable energies. There is one sovereign country in the world right now, which is China. So China is dictating terms because all the sovereign wealth funds rely upon them purchasing energy. And then that lies into investments in the capital markets. And then what happens in America or the West, you have three main powers: technology, which is algorithms and control over media; finance, which is leverage through financial weapons of mass destruction, derivatives; private equity, private credit; central banking, retail banking, investment banking, asset management. And then you have military. But the military are public companies. So while they get a degree of autonomy because they're funded by the Pentagon, they still are public companies. So they rely upon this financial industrial complex. So I call it a FIC, MIC and TIC: financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, and technical industrial complex.
Uh-huh.
I believe that transnational capital through lobby controls Senate, Congress, and through the military and deep state are able to bribe judicial. So everything you see in politics is theatrical uniparty. You get a little bit of left and right that looks like internal difference, but the same financial industrial complex benefits.
Yeah.
And I believe that Trump is very aligned with the financial industrial complex. Biden was very aligned with the military industrial complex, the neocon faction of the world. And I believe that the financial industrial complex want a drastic change in the Middle East, a transition to regional stability and the end of the forever war, because the Gulf countries have co-opted BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and China is now dictating terms. And America can't just blow up the region and prop up the petrodollar.
Right.
So I think everything we've seen over the last 5 years, even when it goes from closed border to open borders, I believe Trump was installed for a specific purpose. I think tariff policy was BlackRock's policy. I think Russia already won the war before Trump was installed. I think that China already won the trade war, and tariffs was the reset of the world order. And I think Iran effectively is escalating this through the closure of Strait of Hormuz for the final battle that leads to a pre-negotiated outcome and deal. But you need to use the US military, Israeli military, and IRGC to effectively get rid of all the US infrastructure in the Middle East, which IRGC is doing. Israel's getting rid of the proxies that are going to be integrated, like Lebanon will integrate with Hezbollah eventually. Anyone's not on board goes. And effectively, America is destroying Iranian infrastructure. And within Iran, you'll notice there's a difference between the IRGC and the government. The government is aligned with China. IRGC are deciding who needs to go in order to move to this new transition. And we're seeing a big theatrical but real and dangerous war in order to manage that transition that really becomes like a fall of the Berlin Wall moment. I don't think Trump knows exactly what comes next, which is why he's so radical in terms of his rhetoric. But this, I do believe, is an escalate to de-escalate. And on April the 15th, Xi Jinping and Trump were meant to meet. That was delayed by a month. And so on May the 14th, Xi Jinping and Trump are meant to meet at the China summit. And I think that will mark the world order, and this will be wrapped up and done by then.
That sounds good. So what do you think? Let's dial it down to the next couple of days. I mean, how do you envision? I mean, he gets increasingly bellicose as he's losing. And he's obviously threatening a nuclear holocaust, which I know he can't do, because the military and others would stop him. But is it a taco as I described with JD Vance, pulling a rabbit out of the hat and saying we've agreed to a 30-day ceasefire? I mean, is that kind of what you would envision happening?
Yeah, so let's look at what we've seen. So the Strait of Hormuz is the economic nuclear weapon, as I'm sure you know from your financial analysis.
Yeah.
So that's closed. So we know that there's a genuine, clock in terms of economic reality, and the humanitarian crisis that will result from this in terms of supply chains. So we know that this can't be an Iraq model, a Syria model, an Afghanistan model. This can't go on for 20 years.
Right.
This has to end soon.
Right.
What do we know? We know that Iran is a natural fortress in terms of its surrounding by mountains. We know that most of their infrastructure is underground.
Right.
We know that they have partnerships with Russian intelligence and Chinese intelligence. We know that the strait is open for China and Iran. We know that Russia's making a lot of money right now, supporting Asia. We know that certain companies in America are making a lot of money, not America as a nation, but, Golden Pass, Cheniere Energy, Chevron, Exxon, a lot of these force majeure contracts are leading to renegotiations at higher prices. We know Europe is screwed, so they're being vassalized. We know that there is asymmetric war right now where the investment from Iran has been in drones and missiles. And we know that large battleships don't solve that problem.
Right.
So all you can do is you can use intelligence like Mossad and CIA to do strategic decapitation campaigns, which is what we've seen. We've seen a lot of IRGC leadership, and we've seen various, forms of regime change happen. But IRGC has still been destroying GCC infrastructure. IRGC has still got the Strait of Hormuz closed. We know that there is, significant damage being inflicted upon Israel as well as the Gulf countries. And so there is no solution to that. There is only a deal. America can't suddenly change its military, but it can destroy a lot of the infrastructure. So what does that mean? That's the Build Back Better model. Who's going to build it back? Well, across the Gulf countries, across Iran, across the whole region, it's only China that can rebuild that back, with Bangladeshis and Indonesians and Filipino labor. But the banks want their deal in. So they need as much damage to give for example, they were forerunning all the deals when Syria sanctions were removed. The same's happening with Iran. And so eventually we get to a deal. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but what's interesting is we've seen a 15-point deal from America, and then we saw a 10-point deal from Iran.
Yeah.
And somewhere we're going to meet in the middle. But what are the main focus is really around the economic model. It's not about anything we were told it is. It's not about regime change. It's not about nuclear weapons. It's not about ballistic missiles. It's all around ports, control of routes, and the removal of sanctions, which is another way of saying opening up new gas pipelines and oil infrastructure. So a deal will be done. And I think just like we saw during the 12-day war, there was a three-way victory. So we had a Hollywood movie where effectively B-2 bombers were sent over from Trump. He said he destroyed the nuclear program. We got all the Hollywood cinematic videos, playing from Pete Hegseth. Israel kind of said, that we defended we took out the leadership. We did a part of our regime change, but there's more to do. And Iran effectively said, we managed to actually get take out the Iron Dome and penetrate. And all of them took that three-way victory. But by the end of it, Israel was loaded up with debt, with ruined infrastructure and ports that don't work anymore. Iran had the same. And America had a Hollywood movie. So by the end of this, I think Israel gets vassalized into a Build Back Better model that regime changes Israel. The same, Iran keeps the IRGC, but it's got a tamer version that's aligned with China. And we need a Hollywood movie in order to get to the final stage. Now, I don't know whether there's more decapitation campaigns to come, whether the IRGC has put up a bigger resistance than they anticipated. I don't know how many things are going wrong. I just believe that nothing stops this train in the end, to quote Lynn Alden, in a different context here. And so I believe that even the rescue mission, there was like some people are speculating that that was a failed ground invasion. And then they were trying to get some nuclear enrichment. I'm not a military expert, but I listen to others that have their theories around that. All I know is that we are leading up to the final acts. There is genuine here. I don't believe we're going to a catastrophic Great Depression and demand destruction that ruins the world for the next decade. I don't believe we're going into genuine World War III, because America can't manufacture a weapon without China right now. Right. So that's a reality. And so the only thing is a negotiated outcome with a Hollywood movie, and I think escalate to de-escalate. And maybe we've got that for the rest of April. Or maybe we get that now. That's the hard bit to predict.
If I may quickly jump in, Simon, because the one thing that immediately struck me with this idea of like a Hollywood ending and like escalating to de-escalating, you talked about nuclear being off the table. I'm curious why you think that nuclear is in fact off the table. And in terms of the most Hollywood ending I could possibly think of, it's Israel runs out of interceptors and threatens the Samson option and threatens nuclear. And then America rushes to find a deal to stop somebody from moving to a nuclear option.
Yeah, my belief is, and it's a belief, that nuclear is nuclear for all markets. And I don't believe the financial industrial complex wants to do that. And I don't believe Israel rules the world. I think they are subjected to the same power structure as UK, Europe, America, and the same power structure. So I think Netanyahu is a puppet as much as Trump is a puppet. Now, definitely Israel is more aligned with the military industrial complex, and Trump, I think, is more aligned with the financial industrial complex and technical industrial complex. But you're starting to see already Netanyahu has been negotiating his exit because there's likely to be, he's going to be the fall guy. There will be a regime change. And what is the new vision of Israel if it's no longer used to destabilize the region? Well, to me, it's pretty obvious. You use Israel as you use UAE for finance to get a foothold in jurisdictions of the multipolar world. UAE is your mechanism for getting into GCC. So you vassalize UAE, and then you do the same for India. And so you've seen that Israel has moved towards India. India is obviously the next strategic tension between China and China and India are the two potential future manufacturing bases. And so what I think you're seeing is Israel moves over towards latching on to India in the BRICS world. And then I don't think we get the blowing up of a nuke. My suspicion, again, is if you go back to JFK, if you go back to Numik, if you go back to military connection to Israel and the nuclear bomb, I believe the same deep state that controls America's nuclear program is the same deep state that controls Israel's nuclear program. Is my personal belief.
Larry?
Interesting. So, well, I'm glad to hear you say that, and I hope you're right. Because there are times when you wonder, if there aren't some crazy actors in this whole drama, and if somebody doesn't go rogue. I mean, certainly a nuclear exchange would be a very, very bad thing. And
Lawrence, have you ever modeled out what you think would happen to markets if a nuke is fired either by Israel or?
I have. I'm pretty sure we'd see everything down, 50 to 75%, almost immediately. And that the printing would follow, and then probably the currency would fail. And we, potentially have to move into kind of a, eat what you kill kind of mode. I mean, I think we'd probably survive, but there would certainly be millions of deaths in certain places where people were unable to be, get fed or have water. it's somewhere you just don't want to go. So I hope and I pray that we never go in that direction. As you point out,
Because some people,
no, go, you go.
yeah, some people believe, like, people have kind of mapped out their understanding of the world. I've laid out my map of the understanding, but some people believe, like, Israel rules the world. They'll blow up a nuke. They'll kill the US empire, and somehow they emerge as like a world power, which I think is completely, it just doesn't face. I don't see that as reality.
Yeah. I think
Other people believe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go
you
ahead.
comment on that one then.
Yeah. So I grew up in, duck and cover drills in the United States. I mean, I still believe in mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
And that what prevents Israel from nuking Iran or the U.S. from nuking Iran is the knowledge that China and Russia can nuke us. And I think, I hope and I pray that, what we learned from the illegal dropping of the bombs in World War II is that, this doesn't end well for anybody, and these can never be used again. And so I still believe that's the base case, absent, a madman getting in there. And I think there are enough checks and balances on the madman. I mean, I think that, let's say Trump were crazy enough to call for a nuclear strike. I'm guessing his military wouldn't let him do it, that they would stop him. So and I don't think he's that much of a madman. I think he's a buffoon, and I think he's an idiot, but I don't think I don't think he wants to die. So, I think I'm pretty much broadly aligned with your vision of how this plays out. But there could be some more stupid moves between here and there. I mean, I read the stuff about the potential. This is a grab of the fissile material, and Trump likes playing with these toys, and he's got Hegseth in there egging him on, and he's got Bibi egging him on. And it wouldn't surprise me if, we have to lose some soldiers, which is, tragic. It's like the school kids, which, I mean, I don't even know. Do you have any view on whether or not there was a double tap going on there? I mean, some say there was, some say there wasn't, that they hit the school, and then when all the parents and first responders got there, they hit it again. Do you know if that's true or not? I don't know.
I think it's hard to say what is true, what isn't true. We're in the fog of war. I've been following every second of it. I have opinions, but I try to stick to what is the bigger picture of where this is going. I think when I get into the micro details and start speculating on them, it can go a little bit funky because there's just too many.
It's too hard to tell.
I think people will know the truth eventually, but is it beyond the US military, the Israeli military, to do insane crimes against humanity? I think everyone got the answer from watching Gaza.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. So it's, the whole thing is incredibly tragic and incredibly scary and hurtful. I mean, I've got kids in their 20s and they're scared. And I'm like, look, this is, cooler heads will prevail. The world's not going to end. But you're watching the reordering of great powers, and this shit is messy. It's extremely messy, and in a Twitter or true social age where you've got a president who uses behaving in an unhinged way as a negotiating tactic, it's going to trigger a lot of people on both sides. And I mean, God knows I got people on my thread on Twitter, saying he's the second coming of Christ and you have to do this. And, they killed 45,000 protesters, which we all know is a lie. They killed some protesters for sure, but were those protesters, provoked by Mossad? Maybe. And, the propaganda on both sides is pretty bad. And I just, in general, I mean, while I don't, love the Iranian regime or the Russian regime or even the U.S. regime, it's these great powers fighting over each other. I mean, I think the average human being in the world just wants to live safely, raise their children, live in peace, and do constructive shit. But sadly, psychopaths exist throughout society. And further, sadly, a lot of them seem to figure out how to get into politics and positions of power. And so that combination, creates a lot of misery for other people, and death. And it's just incredibly tragic. And it goes back to something you and I have as a core belief. And I know you were in it in 2011. I didn't buy my first one until 2013. But I wrote the book because I truly do believe that Bitcoin fixes this, which I know a lot of people claim is incredibly naive. But, imagine a world where government can't print money and the only thing that has real value cannot be destroyed. There's nobody who, let's take a look at this war. Let's say, Trump just put the defense budget up to 1.5, up from, under $1 trillion. If you divide that by the number of American families, you're telling every American family you're going to pay another $5,000 or $10,000 for this war. Nobody would agree to that. They say we're struggling to get by right now. We can't buy gas. We can't buy groceries. Da, da, da. I'm not paying another $10,000 to have this war, and yet that's what we did. Now, we didn't do it through direct taxation. Of course, we did it indirectly because they'll print the money to pay for it. So, it's a really, really broken system. And as I'm sure you know and understand and believe, we were at one of those fourth turning inflection points where, sadly, it's got to get worse, so that we all rise up and kill it in so much as we ever can, and move back to a system that's a lot fairer. And I think that starts at the monetary layer, and that's why I wrote the book. But I know, you pretty much agree with these thoughts, I believe. So
I want to jump in there just for a second quick, if I can, because on that note then, Larry, I'm curious, with Simon's framework that he's laid out here, how does this model fit in with your big print theory? Because the one thing I saw was it's kind of going the opposite direction, that if China's doing the rebuilding, well, then they're the one financing it, they're the one taking out debt possibly to do it, or financing it from their own wealth. But I'm curious how this plays into the big print, if at all.
Well, I think obviously everything they're doing is extremely expensive, and it's interesting to me the way that when the debt level gets to a level at which it cannot be serviced anymore without additional underlying money supply growth, because it is a Ponzi scheme. You've got to, when you take out new debt to spur growth, you need to create more money to service the interest and payment on that debt. And there's a great chart that's on my thread if you go back a few months, and I've done it in a lot of other podcasts where I show it's a chart by Dan Oliver at Murmacan that shows that at any point in time when the money supply hasn't grown enough compared to the debt level, something breaks and then they print. And so the chart shows in 2008, that's exactly what happened. And of course, they had a big print then. It took a few years and it was $3 trillion. But then, they tightened up in 15 and 16, and Yellen and Powell did their best. And we came into 19 and repo blew out and Powell had to pivot, and bingo, very conveniently, the scamdemic arrived, and we had to shut the whole world economy down, and then we had to print another $5 trillion. And so, my suspicion is that what's coming is another one of those. I don't know if it's, if it's based on a war, it's based on, the debt markets collapsing. We don't know how it's been written up and orchestrated, but what we do know, or what I believe with high certainty, because the lines have now crossed again, the base money supply has not grown fast enough to support the debt level, and the chart shows that. What I believe with very high certainty is that at some point they have to do another print. And if the pattern repeats, it'll be bigger than the last one. So we did 3 million in the first one, trillion, 3 trillion plus in the first one, 5 trillion plus in the second one. So this one's probably going to be 7, 8, 9, 10 trillion. And, that'll keep the system functioning, but it will also lead to, inflation like we just had. And the first one created, inflation of financial assets because they sanitized it. They started paying interest on excess reserves, and so it didn't creep out into the economy. And so all the financial assets got, inflated, but we didn't have as much CPI inflation. The second one, the pandemic, they literally printed money and sent it out in stimmy checks, and the size was larger, and so M2 ballooned 40%, and we had huge inflation. And my sense is this one's going to be even worse. So, to me, we live in an inflationary area. I know from listening to Simon's prior podcast that, he believes the only two assets that are going to protect you in this world are the only two sovereign, non-controlled forms of money, and those are gold and Bitcoin. And that's exactly where I am, in self-custody in both cases. I know he's exited all his other equity investments. I still have equity investments in gold and silver miners because I run a legacy fund and I have clients. And so that takes a lot of my time. But actually, I intend to ultimately wind away from that and get out of that business as well, primarily because, you've got management risk in those companies. And, this is, in my view, this is actually going to be a pretty chaotic period. And, I don't want to go full mandibles, on everybody, but I think people need to understand that, things could get kind of messy and ugly in society. in terms of haves and have-nots, and food and water and everything else. And so some of the thoughts that the preppers have with respect to preparing for the future, so to speak, don't seem stupid or far-fetched to me. I mean, I think that I hope and I pray that we don't get into a situation where everything's really that bad, but it could be pretty ugly. I think at a minimum, I mean, I think as a best case, and I was hoping we don't have a World War III, and I don't think we will. As a best case, we just get through this with a currency failure, with the dollar more or less effectively failing, and everybody realizing why it failed. It failed because the government was out of control, couldn't stop spending money, and we transitioned. I've said in prior podcasts, I think probably the timing is about perfect for President Saylor in 2032. And he comes in and he says, "Look, I've got the receipts. I understand how it all happened. Here are the mistakes we made. We built a great world up until 1971 or 1946 or 1913. I mean, generally speaking, the world operated and made a lot of progress on the gold standard. And Bitcoin is digital gold, and it's better. It's easier to verify, move, etc., store. And we are going to return to a Bitcoin standard. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to devalue all this debt and start over again. And so my grandkids will be paying for things in Satoshis. I mean, that's kind of where I think we're going. But, between now and 2032 is, that's a long 7 years or, 6 years. So, it's, and a lot of bad shit can happen, and probably some of it will, sadly. So.
Simon, I want to get your thoughts on that. And I also want to just quickly add in there as well, too. At the end of this, would that mean that there is less demand for dollars outside of the U.S., which would mean their ability to export inflation would go down, and that might also lead to the need to print and stimulus and things at home?
Yeah, I want to comment on a few things because everything you said, I agree with. Few nuances, and I'll pick those up. But firstly, I think we need to be aware of the psychological operations and the impact it's having on our psyche right now. We are effectively, empire is being unmasked, and we're finding out the whole world we thought and knew and understood is completely different to how it actually was. We're spending more time on technology that is really changing, I think, the makeup of how our brains function. We're getting all of this artificial intelligence. I've been on spaces with people where clearly they're reading AI in order to do their thinking. And, we have major, changes in the world. And I, for one, I watched the whole Gaza thing every day because I was involved in the anti-war movement. And it changed me as a human forever. Like I'll never be the same person I was after witnessing some of that. And all I had to do was observe it. I wasn't even there, So all I want to say is that there are these psychological operations, the need to be psychologically strong and see things for what they actually are, is actually a really important thing. And I think we are creating some very strange scenarios with this technology. So it definitely needs some kind of reset. My fear is, and my belief is actually that Bitcoin doesn't fix it. Bitcoin gives the exit for people that want to leave, but I think the financial and technological powers are getting way more powerful. And I think they're partnering with China. And so I do believe that a multipolar world is a better world because of competition. But sadly, I had a long debate with Jeff Booth, which he's more on your side and more optimistic. I think financial powers and technology powers are getting more and more and more powerful. I don't think Bitcoin's going to fix the financial system, but it will provide the exit, and that's where I focus. And so I think the system is so corrupted in terms of anyone that becomes president, anyone that tries to do the right thing in politics. You're either regime changed, assassinated, told that you're a pedophile, or co-opted or forced into a leverage network. And so that's my base case, but I prepare for a better future, I guess. But the way to think about it is to really think of Bitcoin and gold in self-custody as an exit, being more community driven. At the end of the day, if the government ain't going to help you and the system ain't going to fix itself, it comes down to you, your daughter, your children, your family, your local community, and your supply chains. And so everyone, I think, needs to really focus in on that. And you're only going to solve this through community action. And if shit breaks down, you know, it's what's around you that really matters. And you can do incredibly well as a community. You can exit and you can build your parallel systems. And I think saving Bitcoin and self-custody into these weak moments is essential. It's going to be a lifeboat. Yeah, you know, if we get these issues with energy grids and electric grids, you also need to be hedging with gold in self-custody as well. So all of that is there. I think the inflation conversation is really tricky because everything is inflationary. You've got the supply shock, that's inflationary. You've got tariffs, people debated whether those were inflationary. You got the inevitable big print that Lawrence always talks about, that I do agree. You're looking at a $7 to $10 trillion this time. That's inflationary. That does push more K-shaped economy, asset inflation, consumer good inflation. You know, that really pushes these two extremes of the haves and have-nots. And I don't see how that reverses. Just gets worse and worse and worse, I think. And so it's essential for you to do that. Now, do we create an environment where the rich are fine, they adjust to a multipolar world, they can afford their private jets, they've got their Bitcoin in self-custody, they can go anywhere? Well, you know, probably. But do we end up in a demand destruction, deflationary cycle, mass unemployment, artificial intelligence taking Uber's jobs, everyone's jobs, all the service level jobs? Feels like we're moving in that direction. So this inflation might be offset by some kind of disinflation as well. So I'm not sure which direction it goes, but I do know that what are the options for offsetting the inflation? Well, you either tax more to take more money out of the system. That's not going to work so well. You get productivity growth through AI and robotics. That leads to a lot of unemployment. Or what else have you got? Try and get the price of oil down. Okay, well, you probably need to end a war in order to get the price of oil down. And that leads to a deal. So, you know, I don't know any other way of dealing with the inflation other than the Fed buying, buying these assets and doing something that leads to a lot of unemployment. So be prepared. It's confusing.
Let's talk about the technology for a minute, though, because I think it's a very interesting lens to look at it all through. You know, on the positive side, you know, the invention of the and I talk about this in the book, the invention of the microprocessor started the process of decentralization. I mean, we had peak centralization in World War II, right? You know, we had, 20 billion people slaughtered, basically in a pointless, well, not a pointless war, but in a large world scale war, because one madman got control of a country. Kind of sounds somewhat familiar. We started decentralizing, a little bit thereafter, and it really got going with the invention of the semiconductor microprocessor, et cetera, and self-computing. And then the internet, and now kind of anyone can be the New York Times. I mean, we all are the New York Times. We are talking from different parts of the world, broadcasting to thousands of people all over the world. And the question I think it's going to get asked is, do we really need these big central organizations, and do we trust them? Can we all just kind of walk away from them, and ignore them? The flip of that is that, the Palantirs and the technological, I think you call it the TIC, right? The technological industrial complex, they want to know every single thing we do, track everything, have CBDCs, be all over our ass. And, hopefully the liberty-minded folks will, push back on that and will create solutions. I mean, Bitcoin, as an example, is a solution. I mean, they can't, without your keys, they can't steal your wealth. I mean, that's never really existed. I mean, as safe. And then Jason Lowery point out, I mean, armies could overrun other countries and take the money or take the people, and Bitcoin stops that. So, I guess I'm by nature an optimist on the human condition. I feel like we will move. Who says we need enormous nation states? I mean, I think it's an assumption we've all kind of lived with, but I think that can certainly break down, and sovereign individuals can move very quickly from place to place with their wealth. And, they'll tend to probably go to places where they're treated the best. As you point out, Simon, we're going to find these smaller communities with like-minded people, and you'll live there. If you're not willing to live in the big technocratic state that doesn't really offer you much and tracks every one of your movements and every one of your transactions, well, then those states are going to wither away. So I think the technology and the freedom offered by the technology will ultimately save mankind. I really do believe that, but I don't disagree that we're fighting a bunch of different trends. With respect to the AI and the employment thing, I mean, that reminds me of, the Luddites. I mean, in the sense that, figuring out how to do stuff better, cheaper, faster is never bad. I mean, that's good. Productivity increases are good for the human condition. I mean, the reason we all live as well as we do today is because of all the productivity increases we've had. Having said that, we've got to make sure to help people out along the way, to help them retrain, help them move into new things, etc. I mean, obviously in 1913, buggy whip manufacturers were screwed. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of other employment in the country to be had. And so, we will evolve in a positive way. And one of the things is actually, this is kind of a dark moment, this war and a lot of other things. And yet, I mean, to look at the bright side of it, I mean, I find the bright side of it that, basically, I think about 80% of the world condemns this shit. You know what I mean? I mean, I may have my percentages somewhat wrong, but, based on polls, based on Twitter, I mean, yeah, there's a 20% of the world that they're involved in a death cult, and they want to, their team A wants to kill team B and have a Hollywood ending and all the usual crap. But, most of the mature adults in the world don't want to do that shit. And so I view that as a real net positive. I mean, 80%, I mean, if the people in control are part of the 20%, okay, well, you got all this noise going on, but it's kind of like term limits, right? 80% of America wants term limits. We can't get them through because the people who are in a position to do it won't do it. But eventually we're going to throw those people out, and eventually I think the will of the people is going to win. So I guess I am optimistic in a multi-year time frame for coming into a better space, and just getting rid of all this corruption and grift. I mean, I don't think there's anybody in America, and probably the same is true in the UK, who doesn't just look at this government and just say, this thing is so incredibly fucking broken. How can we not do better than this? I mean, it's horrific. I mean, I was reading over the weekend about how, Trump's sons have made $700 million in gains by investing in drone companies right before the war broke out. It's kind of, I mean, the grift everywhere is it's outrageous. I mean, Melania coin is down 97%. Trump coin is down 96%. I mean, it's just, I mean, what? The president of the United States and his family is benefiting. I mean, I'd love to see the trading records. I mean, who the hell was buying all the S&P futures or the oil futures long and short before all these major announcements? I mean, wouldn't you love to know what Howard Lutnick is trading? I mean, it's just, it's sick. It's just absolutely sick, some of the stuff that's going on. And so, I think that if and when we get some people who are reform oriented and just semi-normal, I mean, I'd hold my nose and vote for the other party, if I thought they were just, a step in the right direction compared to the corruption that we've got now. So, and I think most of the world feels that way. So I don't know. I try to be optimistic about it all, but from a day-to-day point of view, and trying to manage a portfolio, that can swing 6 or 7% in a day based on, a tweet. It's like, I'm like, this is no way to run a railroad. This is a mess. So,
Simon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key understanding that people need to come to that helped me is that if you think Trump works for the American people, nothing he's doing makes sense. If you understand that he works for Mick, Tick, and Vic, you realize that he's building a technocratic Orwellian state nightmare. He's giving the funding to the technology companies and the government contracts to Palantir that's needed. He's got the budget up from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. And that's a stimulus check for the military industrial complex. And everything from tariffs to this war will lead to more concentration of power through big print, which leads to the financial industrial complex becoming more and more powerful. Every crisis made the financial institutions more powerful.
Yeah.
You know, from 2008, BlackRock got all the ETF business, and JP Morgan got a bunch of the banks.
All the backing business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, from the, you know, so you can see every crisis is concentrating it. So, and big oil in America, not the Americans, but big oil in America is doing incredibly well, and LNG will benefit a few companies.
Yeah.
So when you understand who he works for, he is actually doing a great job. But if you think he works for you, then you're doing a bad job. And I left UK, you know, I moved to an island a long time ago. I started preparing for this in 2015. Bitcoin gave me that privilege. And so, yeah, I think, you know, the fact that this decentralized technology and the fact that we get to self-custody, the fact that we do need to recognize from the Bitcoin experiment that we all need to run our own LLMs if we're using AI, and we need to create these decentralized networks, because there is a genuine level of disruption that happens to these big companies as well. So they may have a plan. It doesn't mean that they're going to win in their plan.
Right.
But this technology disrupts them just as much, and wars can go incredibly wrong. And, you know, finance in a multipolar world is increasingly challenging to manage as opposed to latching onto one empire. So yeah, we have an interesting time, but I do believe that when we get to this technology side, like, we hit a point where in 10 years, I think everyone needs a 10-year plan today if they haven't started. You know, they need to own more Bitcoin in self-custody. They need to own more gold into this weakness. They can't be speculating using leverage where they get blown up. They need to, you know, really start to think, what happens if my supply chains break? What is my relationship like? Am I spending too much time on technology and not really in the real world and stuff? So people have 10 years to kind of fight against where they're all driving us, because it really feels like there is this World Economic Forum vision of you will own nothing and be happy if you get this wrong. And you'll all be on devices, and we'll be using the algorithms to make you more and more radical in a certain direction and bring out the worst version of yourself. And inflation means you can't afford anything, and you hate the other sex. You're not building, you're not having children. You know, there really does feel like that somebody has that type of agenda, and people need to deliberately exit.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely horrific. I mean, there are a lot of extremely scary trends, and we got to push back against it. And I've tried to counsel my kids on that, to detach and just live. Yeah.
I want to kind of tease that out a little bit, Simon, if I may too. We talked about basically transnational capital, military industrial complex, financial industrial complex, tech industrial complex, and we also like somebody has that agenda. Is it possible to actually get more granular? Do we know some of the people that are pulling these strings, or even just broadly speaking, we can identify the companies? How far can we go in terms of unmasking, pulling back the curtain, actually seeing who is directing this?
Yeah, so people always look for individuals and an organized cabal. I think it's actually it's more simple than that. When I've tried to find these answers, if you look at BlackRock, they now manage effectively. They're up to $14 trillion of assets under administration. Now, some of that's ETFs. A lot of that is not managed, is self-managed, various other things. But they also put the world on Aladdin. And Aladdin is used by $25 trillion of asset managers. That's central banks, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, endowment funds, basically the largest pools of capital all around the world. And so if you go into BlackRock's Aladdin and you ask it to scenario plan, Trump is going to blow up this or Iran's going to do that, it will give everyone in capital the same answers, and capital allocates algorithmically. I think we're even seeing right now the irrationality of the market. I think the stock market is it either believes there's a very quick solution or is vastly underestimated the severity of this. To me, I put that down to it's robots, it's algorithms, it's BlackRock's technology. And, then you have the largest sovereign wealth funds. In the case of Europe, you've got the Norwegian one, you got the Gulf ones. They've had a big hit from this, as obviously their economies have been significantly impacted. And then you've got the largest pool of capital, which is the China side. I believe that all of those pools of capital, they effectively control, when Elon wants to buy X, he ends up borrowing against his stock, which is the financial industrial complex. And then they go to the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and then they're funded by China. So you can see these proxy funding mechanisms that make up transnational capital. And then suddenly the CEO of Saudi Aramco gets a board seat on BlackRock. And then politics changes. So you can kind of see, how, and BlackRock's essentially got 20,000 board seats now across their network of corporations. So you got $25 trillion in technology.
Well, it's the thinkest head of the WEF too, isn't he now?
Yeah, now Larry Fink is the interim chairman or whatever of the World Economic Forum. And who does, and then who does Larry Fink work for? So you've got that structure, right? Most people focus on the executives. Well, anyone that knows governance, that you have executives that work for boards that work for shareholders, and then shareholders use shell company through British colony offshore structures in order to obfuscate ownership. But BlackRock is approximately 45% owned by Bank of America, and then you have Merrill Lynch, and then you have legacy European finance families on top of that. But you can see that they all own shares in each other. And BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, up to the banking infrastructure, sovereign wealth funds, is institutionalized. So I don't think it's this organized cabal. I think there's layers of governance, but they are all governments with the exception of, CCP and some of the ones that nationalize their oil resources. They're subordinate to transnational capital. And so I just don't see anything that a politician does as being not dictated by their lobby. And at the very, very worst, deep state operations like happened to JFK if you get too far out of line.
Yeah, that's right.
There, any thoughts?
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. I mean, it's they're all part of the same system, and it's been around for a long time. It's like Carlin said, it's a big club. We're not in it, and and they have to play within a certain set of boundaries. If they get too far out of those boundaries, they get in trouble. You see them get reined back in. It's interesting though. There are dissenters and leaks from the system. I mean, I've recently been very, very enthralled with this Maloney, this Italian PM, who has pushed back on some of the war stuff and just other things in general. And so there are,
they are a bunch of psychopaths, and they all do want to gain more power from each other. So it's a ruthless, brutal game at the top of lawlessness.
Yeah,
leverage and covert operations.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, look, when you have the militaries behind you, and you can do a lot of stuff, right? And that's why the regime change stuff that the U.S. has been doing for years. I mean, I read the Devil's Chessboard. You look kind of through the history of the CIA, and you realize that the U.S. we're not always the good guys. I mean, we like to think we are, and there's some things about this country that are fabulous, and the founding documents were pretty unique, but we haven't always lived up to that standard. and sadly,
Well, I think that's an important point, because without truth, we're just using bad data. So in this unmasking moment, we're entering into a world where you're radically disjointed from reality because you kind of believe the old gods,
right.
or you're in an algorithm that's turning you insane, or you're actually figuring out how the world works, which is why I really appreciate like these podcast spaces. And it's why like you really need to concentrate and stand at guard of your mind and filter what's coming in. Because you could be doom looping and doom scrolling all sorts of stuff. And if the content is being dictated to you, you're likely serving someone else's agenda. So you really need to find your people that you resonate with, that seem to, be pushing out a message, and understand what alternative agendas they may have. And just follow the money is what I've always done. Like just, understand that there are these incentive mechanisms. Follow the money. And to me, if someone's pushing you into Bitcoin in self-custody, then you either just believe, okay, they're trying to pump their bags, but come on, man, no one. I was around in Bitcoin where what I said was important. I'm irrelevant to what happens to Bitcoin at this stage. Like
we all are individually, and collectively we may not be.
I was gonna say, it doesn't matter how many people I teach to do self-custody. There's no way I'm moving that price point.
No,
exactly.
There are very few.
We could shit our backs is ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I have people just trying to get people, boomers to buy ETFs. I have a hard time with it. So it's, we're still very early, sadly, in the migration to the sound money thesis. But you can see it's coming. It is building, and it's Lynn's nothing stops this train. It's just getting more and more true. I mean, I feel like, looking at the Bitcoin price and the gold price, we're on the cusp of a big move upward. I go back to that chart that I referenced earlier, where they've just got to get more money into the system. I mean, it's breaking. And it's interesting, we could talk a little bit about what I think is coming. Kevin Warsh will be Fed chairman, middle of next month. And, my sense is he didn't get that job unless he made certain promises and commitments. And so I think it's pretty certain that he will come up with a new program of some kind. He will have I don't know what they're going to call it. I'm not sure how they're going to do it, but very similar to what they did with Silicon Valley Bank, where, they've created BTFD, or, more recently they've got reserve management, which is really only QE, just rebranded. There's going to be a mechanism. There has to be mathematically a mechanism that allows them to inject more money into the system. I think it's going to be something along the lines of, it'll have a national security component to it, and it'll be very similar to what they did in World War I, where they said, buy Liberty bonds, and they let the banks borrow at 3%, and then they sold Liberty bonds at 3.5%, and the banks made 50 points free carry. And so I don't know what this will be, but it'll be something. I think there'll be something like that, where they'll say, hey, they don't want to put it on the Fed balance sheet because they know that we all know what that means. Although it would probably hit the sheet somehow. Maybe they'll figure out a way to keep it off the sheet, but where they'll say, hey, banks, we will give you these swap lines of this money at these low rates, but the quid pro quo is you will then use them to buy duration in the treasury market. And, which is effectively yield curve control. But it's not yield curve control via the Fed. It's yield curve control with the banks as the proxy in the middle. And there'll be a new name and a new term for it. And then, to the degree that anyone squawks, they'll just say, well, look, this is really just a matter of national security, because, we live in kind of an uncertain world, a wartime world, and we have to be able to finance the government going forward. And, please, don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. So I feel like that's got to be coming, and it probably is likely this year. I mean, he could give that speech right after he's, appointed or confirmed. He could give it a couple months later, but I feel like it's coming this year. And I think those of us who understand how the money machine works and the levers at the Fed, the market is just the market for sound assets is just going to scream. I mean, gold's going to head towards 10,000, and Bitcoin's going to head towards 400,000, within, years, I mean, or months, and the first part of that. So, to me, that's what I think is kind of the next chapter. And so, I'm just sitting here waiting for, his confirmation and waiting to see what he unveils, because I'm pretty sure that's what's got to happen.
I'll say quickly, Simon, before you jump in there, I just wanted some clarification, Larry, on something you were saying. My understanding is that there is some limitation on the commercial bank's ability to hold treasuries. They have some sort of cap.
Well,
You're aware
yeah,
of
they
some-
have a SLR and some other restrictions, and I think that'll all get thrown out. You know,
Yeah.
they'll just open it up and let them buy as much as they want, because they really have to. I mean, who else is going to hold the paper, right? So
No, that makes perfect sense. Simon, your thoughts?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Again, concentration of power into financial industrial complex as a result of some favorable trade. Yeah, there's no doubt there was a regime change at the Fed. I think it's quite interesting that everyone, sees him as hawkish. I guess there's a couple of conspiracy theories. Either he just does what was meant to be done, which I think I'm more aligned with you, or others say that he's actually going to be hawkish and reset the world order and kill the US empire. I don't think that's happening. I think they print right till the end and they squeeze everything they can out of the US economy. They push the wealth inequality and K-shaped economy to asset strip absolutely everything, and everyone needs to protect themselves from it. And the government will lie throughout the whole process.
Oh, yeah.
And and tell you that this is MAGA and everything, but everyone just needs to have their own plan around that. But I think that's very feasible.
To be fair, the economy will keep rolling. Unemployment may be low. Even to the extent they're successful, they may be able to push wages up and help. If the money were directed at infrastructure and the correct things, there could be some quote unquote economic benefit. Very much the way that post World War II, we had a lot of inflation, right? When we had yield curve control until 1952, and then they took it off. And there were some months where the inflation was running at 19 or 20%. There were a couple of 1 month periods where that happened. But, we were coming out of the war, all the GIs came home, they're buying houses, they're buying cars, and the economy was cooking. So, the inflation sucked, but there was, at least everyone was working and there was growth. And so, when you're employed, I mean, the kind of the worst of all worlds is 29, where you're unemployed, you can't find a job, everything sucks, and, and prices have fallen, but not enough. If they have an inflationary crack up boom, obviously the inflation eats you alive and the people on fixed incomes get killed. But, if you're young and you're working, there'll probably be a lot of work for you, and wages will probably be going up pretty healthily. So, I mean, you're facing trade-offs, but in a system like the one we've got, it's inflate or die. I mean, Richard Russell said this years ago. It's really true. And, they're pushing against this. I mean, you said you had a conversation with Jeff, who's a friend. They're pushing against a system that naturally creates deflation, but they've got a financial system that's designed where it has to have inflation. And so there's only one way to square that circle, and that's to print the goddamn money. So, you just know it's coming. What's so hard, and for me as somebody who's trying to help people get into Bitcoin, is it's incredibly hard to get people to think in 5-year timeframes in the world that we live in. Everyone thinks in months and quarters, and and you got the Peter Schiffs of the world dunking on Sailor because Bitcoin gold's outperformed Bitcoin for a few years, and it's like, okay, just relax. Let's take a 17-year view of it all. Bitcoin's going to bury gold. So, and by the way, I love both, as you guys know. I just like Bitcoin a little better. So to me, that's what we have to look forward to. And I don't know. Simon, I'd like to ask you though. I mean, at the end of the day, how do you think all this ends for Trump? I mean, where do you do you think he gets to write his Hollywood ending? Do you think is there any recovering from where he's gone? Because he really blew up his base. I mean, I was talking to my daughter about it yesterday, and sometimes I honestly think that what happened here was Israel ran the operation they ran, with Mossad, and they do have films of him with young girls. I mean, obviously really young girls. And they literally said to him, very much the way probably Obama got told, what he had to do if he wanted to stay alive. They very much said to him, look, man, it's just a simple call. You're either going to attack Iran or we're going to release all these films, and, you're going to jail and you're going down in history as the biggest pedophile known to man. I mean, how do you see Trump? How do you see it ending for Trump? What do you think? How do you think he got to this position where he betrayed his base in such an obvious way?
Yeah. Again, this is why people call me TDS, because I know Trump's history and I studied Trump's history. But he was mentored by Roy Combs, and he married his daughter into the Charles Kushner family with Jared Kushner. And Charles Kushner was effectively Jeffrey Epstein before Jeffrey Epstein, if you look at his court documents. Huh. And so he's always been around these grooming operations into the Jeffrey Epstein network. You know, like Lex Wexner and Victoria's Secrets was like a grooming operation into these things. And when you make money in New York through real estate, you have to be connected to the mob and mafia to get these transactions. He did a bunch of laundering for Russian Jewish power via some of his Trump Towers and some of his real estate transactions. Jared Kushner is you know, it's his son-in-law. And Charles Kushner, basically, if you look at some of his court documents, he ordered a prostitute for his brother, filmed it, and then blackmailed him in order to get what he wanted. He ended up in prison and went down for it, but I think he later got pardoned as well. But if you look at who Trump has always been around, he's always been in those Zionist circles. And so, you know, I don't, you know, I think he's leveraged to the tilt, always has been leveraged to the tilt. And I think he didn't change. I think he's always been part of this. So his first administration furthered a lot. He took out Qasem Soleimani, which was the number one person that was killing ISIS, and then pretended like he's taking on ISIS, even though he took out the person that's killing ISIS. He, you know, put the embassy in Jerusalem and changed it from international to effectively Israel. If you look at his funding, his three largest funders were Elon Musk, the technical industrial complex, the Mellon banking dynasty, the financial industrial complex, and Mariam Edelstein, which is the Israel military industrial complex side. So to me, his job is to get rich. His job was to be an agent of chaos. And he'll end with the presidency that effectively ended the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. Those that are clued on will say that was the when we moved to multipolarity and it was the end of the US empire. And his cult will say he took on the Fed, he took on the deep state, and they'll continue to buy his projects and look for Q drops and be in his cult for till the end of time. And then blame what happens next on the fact that, you know, Trump didn't get to finish his mission. I do think he gets his Hollywood movie. I do think he declares victory. But I don't think he's able to do much more here than extract wealth, do more corrupt trades, funnel more money into the Middle East, and profit from this transition to multipolarity. So,
if I can, Simon, quickly, just for clarification, because I didn't quite follow, are you suggesting that Trump is corrupt or that he was compromised? And then additionally, Larry, to your earlier point, I had a nice conversation. Yeah, maybe both. I guess both. Had a nice conversation with Lou Groman the other day, and the thing that he pointed out to me that I thought was really interesting is how we view Bush today, and how you see him sitting with like Obama and laughing them up, and he's kind of like brought back into the limelight, and the corporate media holds him up. And so I wonder if Trump, even if he's vilified and destroys his legacy now, if basically the media industrial complex tries to prop him back up 10 years from now.
Oh, I don't know. I think it might be pretty hard to do, but yeah, I mean, there are all the memes on Twitter about how, you know, Bush can now say he's not the dumbest president ever, which I always get a chuckle out of. And, you know, I was very underwhelmed by Bush's presidency, and it really was the Cheney presidency. You know, and they took the bait and fell for, you know, wasting $8 trillion in the Middle East. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what his legacy will be. I gotta believe it's going to be pretty hard to resurrect, to be frank. I mean, when I look at the hole he's dug for himself, he may be loved in Israel, but other than that, I gotta think I think he's got an uphill slog to restore his base. I mean, there are so many people. I mean, I was never MAGA. I was never anti-MAGA. I kind of tolerated the guy. I was never blue team. I've always been kind of libertarian. You guys probably know it. Supported Ron Paul in a big way. And I now support Thomas Massey in a big way. My view is that he in executing this pivot to become a warrior, he shot himself in the foot in a big way, in a really big way. And when you get on Twitter and you see, I mean, there's nobody more pissed off than these people. I campaigned for him. I voted for him 3 times. I did this. I mean, these people just absolutely, positively loved him, and now feel betrayed. And I get it. I mean, they bought into something that he didn't live up to. So I totally get it. I don't feel quite that way, because I always, I remember him. I was doing business in the 80s and 90s, and I remember the stories of, all the casinos down on the Jersey Shore, and the way, I read the papers, and the way he stiffed all his contractors and just said, tough shit, I'm not paying you. And cheating on his wife. And I mean, just his behavior, this is not some new secret. I mean, it's not like he hasn't left a trail of bodies for, his entire business career. So all you had to do was a little bit of research, and you kind of could get a sense of what you were dealing with here. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for the MAGA people who say, oh, well, yeah, I was betrayed. Well, do your homework, But anyway, it is what it is, and he is who he is.
Simon?
Nathan, what I wanted to do is, whenever I do these videos with you, people are like, that's bullshit. There's no, what's your actual sources and evidence? So I just wanted to say, I'll send you 4 links, because obviously I can't below stuff, but I'll do one on the best, all the sources behind 9/11, the other on JFK, the other on Iran-Contra affair, and the other on Trump in his blackmail operations in the early days. So four different links of what I believe to be the actual source materials and court documents that will help you get beyond, oh, really, is that just a conspiracy theory?
Yeah, that'd be
I will
nice.
have all those in the description down below. Yes, thank you for that, Simon. Actually, quickly on that note too, we have maybe a little bit of time. Lawrence, do you have any questions about any of those?
No, I don't. I was wondering though, Simon, I assume you've read all of Whitney Webb's work. Have you been through her stuff? Yeah.
Yes.
I have not. See, one of the disadvantages I've got, I'm still working. I'm still managing this fund. So I spend my day talking to companies and trying to understand who's got a good gold deposit. And so I haven't had, I listened to Simon, who's got this encyclopedic knowledge of, world history and events and geopolitics. And I watch the monetary side very carefully. But I haven't had as much time or to dig into these things. Although over time, a long time ago, I became a deep student of the JFK assassination. My father was a veteran. I remember saying to him, this is back 25 years ago, he's passed, 30 years ago now. And I remember saying, Dad, you do realize the CIA killed, Kennedy, right? He went nuts. He went absolutely, because he just loved America, and he refused to accept the possibility that our government could actually be that evil. And yet, if you took the time, I have books and things that were unpublished by people. I was a part of a community that really dove deep into that whole particular issue. And I am so absolutely certain of what happened there that, there's just no doubt in my mind. And yet, here's a loyal Midwestern businessman who served in the Army and was a good man. And I told him that, and he was pissed off at me. He thought I was way out of line. But, you've got to follow the evidence, and there's enough evidence on some of these things. And obviously Simon has taken the time to follow the evidence. I look forward to exploring some of those links.
Larry, just on that note, do you ever think most people will wake up? Like, does it have to be some sort of major pain point, or do you think it's always going to be kind of this Pareto distribution, 80-20, 20 that actually dive in and maybe
you mean wake up to sound money or wake up to all the broken stuff? I think a lot of people have woken up to the broken stuff. I know that, my 20-year-old son, 20-plus-year-old son, is absolutely convinced that Kennedy was killed by the CIA. He, is very negative on Israel and their role. I mean, and his peer group all gets it too. I mean, this is not. I think there's a generational component here. If you're a big fat happy boomer who've lived within the system and you've got your wealth and life is good, and I mean, I was with one of my investors, very wealthy guy, the other day, nice guy, I like him, having a breakfast with him, and I said, how do you feel about the Iran war? He said, well, it's a problem. We're going to have to deal with them sooner or later. Might as well do it sooner. And I just was like, really? You haven't thought it through, but it's not going to affect his life, and he just reads the papers and believes the narrative, and I mean, they have said death to Israel, so therefore we ought to go attack them. And that's not uncommon in my age group, I don't think.
Yeah. No, same here with the Canadian Conservatives. It's quite frustrating that they can actually they can wake up to some aspects of sound money and government overreach, but that one is just a sacred cow that they can't seem to look past or see for what it really is. Before we kind of wrap, Simon, there was one other thing that I wanted to quickly touch on. We've got the May 14th, I think it's May 14th, 15th China summit coming up here as well. Is there anything in your mind that viewers, that the audience can be on the lookout for that might signal we're getting that Hollywood ending? Is there anything in particular that you kind of theorize or think might pop up, or basically is it kind of one of those things like adult content when you see it,
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like the things that these psychopaths are willing to do, kind of always. It's like that. I'm not surprised, but when it actually happens, you're surprised. It's one of those things. Like, I still can't believe the things that they're willing to do. And when it actually happens, so and anything is on the table. My belief is that the economics don't make sense for this to be a long war. And I don't think a nuclear war makes sense. So the only thing that makes sense is a deal. And when I think about it, I think Xi Jinping, you don't get a press department for China. You don't have politics of trying to win the midterm election for China. And to not believe that these, Iran as a 6,000 year culture that took on the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and is still there. And China, which has been through the century of humiliation, dynasty after dynasty, and Russia, who's been through, everything that it's been through. Then you have these long-term leaders. To not think that they didn't have a very intelligent long-term plan, I think is infeasible. And I think you can see it executing. I think Russia won the war with Ukraine. I think China won the trade war with America. And I think Iran won this war through the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But who really is in charge here? I think it's obvious that the American military relies upon rare earth minerals from China. Iran relies upon oil purchases from China. Russia relies upon sanction relief from China. The Gulf countries rely upon oil purchases from China. The entire world relies upon exports from China. And there are 110 countries that have connected into the CIPS Chinese payment system. There were 26 negotiations with trade routes and ports between BlackRock and China. And there is a new military industrial complex that has drone, missile, and new technology, and a $1.5 trillion Belt and Road Initiative that's not regime changing, not destroying countries, not telling them how to do things, just building infrastructure and asking them to buy their products. The fact that I think Xi Jinping is the one that has a real plan, and that's the one that was playing the 6D chess. So look out for that meeting. If it moves, I'm a bit concerned because it means that we got more destruction and more economic destruction. If it happens, I'm pretty sure this needs to be wrapped up before then. if this is still going on when that meeting is happening, then there's something I missed, and I need to come back here and and tell you
Figure
what
it out. Awesome. I love it. Simon, tell everybody where they can find you, and then Larry, you as well.
Yeah, so at Simon Dixon Twit on X, from when it was called Twitter. And then I publish everything on my YouTube channel, Simon Dixon 21. And in case I get cancelled on anything, I back everything up at SimonDixon.com.
Beautiful. Larry?
Lawrence Lepard on X/Twitter, and I have a website, ema2.com, where there's a newsletter that I write quarterly talking about the economic picture. That's free. It's historically, you can see it. There's at the bottom of the page, you can put your email in there, and we'll never spam you. You'll get it automatically every quarter. So
Amazing. And don't forget to pick up the big print.
yeah, oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, the book explains the monetary side of what's about to happen.